How the most infamous serial killers were caught. The date is April 16th, 1975. You are Sergeant Bob Hayward, a Utah Highway Patrol officer doing his nightly patrol. You're driving up and down suburban roads thinking about this crazy shark movie that just came out called Jaws, when all of a sudden you notice something peculiar. You see a tan 1968 Volkswagen Beetle parked outside of a house at 3 a.m. Reasonably, this looks suspicious to you, so you take a closer look. However, as you approach the vehicle, they speed off. You pursue this vehicle, and fortunately, you're able to pull it over. This person was obviously up to no good, and you don't know what you're walking up to. You exit your cruiser and walk towards the vehicle with your gun drawn. Deep down, you're terrified, and you just hope that the other person is more terrified than you are. You command the driver to get out of the Beetle, and they comply. They apologize and say that they were just up late watching a movie in the drive-in theater. However, the movie the suspect claimed they had seen at the drive-in wasn't playing at the drive-in, and you knew that, which made you suspicious enough to check their vehicle. A decision that likely has a significant impact on the course of history. During the search of your vehicle, you find a lot of things, and it seems that they only get more and more grim. You find gloves, pantyhose, ripped sheets, rope, a flashlight, a ski mask, an ice pick, trash bags, and handcuffs. Things that normal people don't keep in their vehicle. Although possessing these items and keeping them in your car is suspicious, it's not a crime. However, fortunately, you were able to still bring this suspect in for evading an officer. You collect information about your suspect and you realize that his name is Ted Bundy, a name that you will soon never forget. Ted wasn't in jail long as he was freed on bond, but your findings in his vehicle were enough to get you talking, specifically to your fellow officers. You speak to detectives at your station about this encounter, and they too find the description of this Volkswagen Beetle and the name Bundy oddly familiar. It's at this point when the detectives in Utah contact investigators in Washington, where they learn that this weird Bundy guy was on their very short list of murder suspects in a series of murders. Coincidentally, however, the murders that took place in Washington stopped as soon as Bundy left and relocated from Washington to Utah. And coincidentally as well, disappearances then started to begin in Utah. If alarm bells weren't already ringing, they were now off the chain. If you're watching this video, I'm assuming it's no spoiler that Ted Bundy is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. His unbelievably depraved actions are the reason we still talk about him to this day, as a cautionary tale. Let me quickly summarize his methods. Ted Bundy was a wolf in sheep's clothing, always hidden in plain sight. Although he was an active serial killer, he was working within the justice system and was even present on his own crime scenes. Not only that, but he had an unassuming character. He was considered handsome, looked and acted normal, and was considered charming by some. And he more so fit the description of a model citizen than a serial killer, which is one of the biggest reasons why he was able to go on for so long without being caught. It's actually quite upsetting to know how many pretty obvious clues were ignored by the police simply because they just didn't assume Ted was the type of guy to do that, which is obviously why you should never judge a book by its cover. Ted Bundy was a very methodical killer, with a system that he had down to a science. Ted preyed on primarily young white women. He would typically lurk around colleges and universities where he could easily find his next victim. But he usually wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was directly in your face and would approach women, typically in an arm sling or crutches to appear helpless and to gain sympathy points from the woman, and he would ask random women if they would be able to help him either put books in his car or something along those lines. Basically any lie to get the women to believe that they're helping a helpless, kind gentleman do something in or around his car. And if these kind women did make it to his vehicle, chances were it was basically done for them. At this point, Ted would bludgeon these women, typically to the point of unconsciousness or even death, and then do a multitude of things, typically engaging in on top of mutilating the body in ways that I can't even begin to explain, such as cutting off the victim's head and keeping it as a trophy and taking pictures with his victims as a sort of twisted, happy memory. And then once he felt he was done, he would dump the body somewhere, typically in multiple pieces. But even then, in some instances, he wasn't done, as there is cases where he would go back to visit these bodies he had dumped multiple times. Ted Bundy was extremely twisted, but fortunately, this video is focused on justice. And in this case, justice was served, albeit much later than it should have been. The string of murders committed by Ted Bundy had been going on for years at this point. But on November 8th, 1974, 1 year before his run-in with the police at the beginning of this segment, Bundy kidnapped a woman that would soon become his downfall. He picked up this 18-year-old woman from the Fashion Place Mall outside of Salt Lake City, Utah. And of course, he had devious intentions. But unlike many before her, she was able to escape, saving her life. Over 1 year later, on October 2nd in 1975, only 2 months after the run-in with the police, this same woman picked Bundy out of a lineup in the police station, confirming that this man was the man who kidnapped her 1 year prior. And this one positive ID in this one police lineup was able to bring this entire thing to justice, as 1 year later on March 1st, 1976, Bundy was found guilty for kidnapping and sentenced up to 15 years. Obviously, Bundy did much worse than kidnapping, but this was a start. And for him, he saw this as the beginning of the end. But if you think this is the conclusion of how Ted Bundy got caught, you're definitely mistaken, because this is only the first of many times this man was caught. In 1977, another year later, Bundy was extradited to Colorado for the murder of one of his victims, which was progress in terms of justice. But during this time, he escaped from a second-story window when he was left alone for only a few moments. He spent 6 days living in the wild outside of the prison in Aspen and was then found and taken back into custody. However, only a few months later, he escaped from his jail cell in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And things took a dark turn once again. Bundy wasn't living in the woods for 6 days. He was on the run for months, and during this time, he would attack 5 people and kill 3 of them. And by people, I mean young, innocent women. On February 15th, 1978, another officer spotted a stolen vehicle around 1:30 a.m. in Pensacola, Florida, and decided to pursue this vehicle. Once again, Bundy was taken into custody, and this officer didn't even know the level of monster that he had in the back of his cruiser. When Bundy was brought to the police station, he refused to say his name for over 2 days. A detective was able to get him to confess that his name was Theodore Chapman Bundy, but for some reason the detective didn't connect the dots and realize that this was Ted Bundy, the serial killer that was currently on the loose. Fortunately, this mistake wasn't extremely consequential, as they did shortly after connect the dots. And on July 24th, 1979, Ted Bundy was convicted on 2 counts of murder. Although while he was in custody, he admitted to over 30 murders, and there is suspected to be even more, although those are not confirmed. On January 24th, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed at Florida State Prison at the age of 42. So now, if somebody asks you, how did Ted Bundy get caught? Not only do you know the answer, but now you know to ask, well, which time? The time he was first brought into custody for acting suspicious, the time that he ran away from the courthouse and was in the trees for 6 days and then was caught and brought back, the time that he broke out of prison with a hacksaw and was on another killing rampage for 2 months before being brought back. There's a few times he was caught, but in all seriousness, my description of this case only scratches the surface, and even the process of how he was caught and his court chronicles, where he not only represented himself but also proposed to his girlfriend at the time in court. There's a lot of lore to this story, and if you want to learn more about it, I actually have a video that goes specifically in depth on these serial killers, which I'll put at the end of the video. Bundy was executed via the electric chair with crowds watching as he perished, and his final words were a message of love for his family and friends, if he even had any left. The year is 1978. You're a police officer in Ohio. It's Friday night and you just started your shift. Due to a new safe driving initiative, you're tasked with field sobriety tests. And so far, your night is uneventful. A car drives up to your cruiser and stops. You look inside the vehicle and it's a young man. An awkward looking one at that. He and the car both seem normal, but you get an odd vibe. You ask him if he'd been drinking and awkwardly, he says no. He doesn't seem drunk, just strange. And to alleviate your discomfort, you let him go. Little did you know, the person that you just spoke with wasn't any ordinary teenager. You just stopped one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. Not only that, he had the body of his first victim in the car with him. You had just let go Jeffrey Dahmer. If this police officer had potentially acted more so on his strange feeling and looked around more, potentially one of the most infamous and disgusting serial killers would have been caught a lot sooner. But unfortunately, this early encounter was uneventful and marked the beginning of his disgusting killing spree. Jeffrey Dahmer, similar to Ted Bundy, was a rather unassuming serial killer who was social, active in the community, likable, and for those reasons, able to operate almost directly under the nose of the police for way longer than he ever should have been able to. Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't a particularly brilliant serial killer who crossed all of his T's and dotted all of his I's. If you're familiar with how he committed his murders and what he did after the fact, there was a lot of opportunities for evidence to be found and dots to be connected, and unfortunately, the police took way too long to connect those dots. Jeffrey Dahmer's father was an analytical chemist, which may seem unassuming but led to a morbid curiosity that ended up consuming Jeffrey Dahmer's life. Jeffrey's father taught him how to preserve animal bones with bleach, and they would even look around their property together to find dead animals to dissect and preserve and bleach the skin and connective tissue of these dead animals. Jeffrey's father thought he was sharing insight into his career with potentially interesting information, but to Jeffrey, this information was highly interesting, and unfortunately, it was taken in a completely wrong direction, which we'll get into. On top of this weird dissection and scientific process, if you want to call it that, Jeff showed signs of trauma in his younger years, specifically torture butchering animals and being rather quiet and reserved. His father even admitted that there were signs that he didn't notice at the time, which is questionable. After graduating high school, Dahmer attended a party, something he did relatively often as he tried his best to be social and was at this point already experiencing a rather nasty alcohol addiction. On the way home after this party, Jeffrey picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, another 18-year-old man. They both went back to Dahmer's place to hang out and drink, and while Stephen didn't have any sort of romantic intentions, Jeffrey did. And when Jeffrey got the clue that things likely weren't going to happen, he took matters into his own hands in the worst way possible. Dahmer grabbed a dumbbell and hit this man over the head, knocking him unconscious. He then strangled the man and then assaulted his body for his own personal satisfaction. And then at that point, used what he had been practicing on animals on a person for the first time. And unfortunately, this was not the only time either. After mutilating and dismembering the body, Dahmer packed it into his car where he was driving to dispose of it. And it was on this drive where Dahmer met the police officer. If only this police officer chose to do a search, we would be living in a much different timeline. But unfortunately, that was not the case. And although Dahmer was caught, he was not caught then. And after this instance, he was able to kill and hurt many more people. At the age of 19, Dahmer got involved in the military, where he was suspected to have done unsavory things with soldiers and was kicked out at the age of 22. After this, he began his hand in the professional world where he was unsuccessful in holding a steady job due to his alcohol abuse. He started exposing himself to women and children at playgrounds where he was caught and charged for indecent exposure, although this will be one of his most tame convictions we touch on in this entire video. Dahmer's sadistic urges were beginning to take a hold of him, and he was back on the hunt, looking for control. It was around this time in his early 20s where Dahmer began frequenting bathhouses and gay bars, where he would meet men, hang out, and then take control, to put it in his words. Dahmer was most commonly drinking these men that he was meeting under the table, and due to his high alcohol tolerance, the people that he was with were unable to keep up and likely would pass out before Jeffrey was even feeling a buzz. In these instances, Jeffrey would take advantage of these people, but even with how manipulative and horrible this is still only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer. He wasn't really convicted for any of these unwanted touchings, but he did get a 1-year probationary sentence for indecent exposure once again. In 1987, Dahmer knew that indecent exposure and drugging and assaulting men just wasn't enough, and he felt that he needed to get back to his old ways. Dahmer said that this second murder in the beginning of this next chapter of serial killings was actually an accident. He said he just woke up in a hotel with a dead person beside him. And even if that was true, any normal person would at that point call the police. But of course, that's not what Jeff did. Dahmer stuffed this person into a suitcase and took him out of the hotel. He took this body back to his grandmother's house, where he dismembered it, assaulted the body, and cut this person's head off and boiled it to keep the skull for his own personal use, to say the least. This trend would continue drugging, assaulting, and killing men over the next years. I know I've already gotten into detail, but there is so many disgusting and gruesome details associated with exactly what Jeffrey Dahmer would do to his victims, and there is a ton of videos about that. So let's focus in on the point of this video. Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. But how exactly did he get caught? Well, as he continued his spree, he got less and less cautious and more hasty, as he simply cared less and less and was too caught up in his own fantasies, it seemed. On July 22nd, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer lured a man named Tracy Edwards into his apartment, offering to pay him $100 for nude photographs. When they got to the apartment, that's when things started to go wrong. Dahmer attempted to handcuff this man and threatened him with a knife, and Edward smartly played along, trying to keep Dahmer calm and unassuming of him trying to escape. After spending 5 hours together, Tracy was able to punch Dahmer in the face and flee, getting out of the apartment and onto the street where he flagged down 2 police officers. At this point, Tracy was barely clothed and still had a handcuff on his wrist. The police followed Tracy back to Dahmer's apartment where Dahmer admitted to putting handcuffs on this man, but doing nothing wrong. However, the police weren't satisfied with that answer and searched the apartment, which is when one of the officers discovered Polaroid photographs of dismembered bodies. And after seeing this evidence, the police handcuffed Dahmer after a bit of a power struggle. A search that took place later on uncovered a collection of human remains and other vile things that I won't even get into. Dahmer confessed to all of the murders and waived his right to a lawyer during his interrogations. And over a 2-week span, detectives were able to get Dahmer to admit to his crimes and detail them specifically. And in detail, he outlined 17 murders of men and boys between 1978 and 1991. The following year, on January 13th, 1992, Dahmer pled guilty but insane to 15 counts of murder. Dahmer wasn't sentenced to death in the court system, but he was by another inmate. And during his time serving 15 consecutive life sentences, He was beaten to death with a blunt object by another inmate. Some people thought this was a poetic ending to his reign of terrors, while others didn't think that this was quite justice. No matter how you feel about this situation, the Jeffrey Dahmer story is extremely upsetting and honestly disgusting, and if you haven't seen it yet, there's an entire Netflix documentary about it. But to answer your question, how was Jeffrey Dahmer caught? One of his victims was finally able to escape and expose his human deli to the police and eventually the world. I do want to say that because I do post weekly, I'm not able to make extremely long videos. I try my best though, and I think on average 15 to 30 minutes isn't bad. But with that being said, unfortunately, there is a lot of serial killers that have existed, and fortunately, there are a lot who have also been caught. Ideally, there wouldn't be any serial killers to catch, but that's a different story. I say this because if you guys enjoyed this topic and this video, I would love to make another one, potentially a part 2, and maybe even make a series out of it. So before we get into our last killer, if you guys enjoy learning about these serial killers and how they eventually got caught, let me know in the comments below or give this video a like. If I see enough comments, then I will definitely make a part 2. Now, let's start the story. You're a young man in the Chicago area, and you're looking for a job. You just graduated high school and you don't want to go to college, you want to get into the trades. It's a growing opportunity that doesn't require an education, and that interests you. Your uncle's friend is a local business owner and politician, and he says that this man could help get you a job. He introduces you to this man and you guys set plans to discuss a potential employment opportunity. This man invites you over to dinner, which you're rather comfortable with because you've seen this man before and you've even been to a few of his events. He's been known to have block parties and he even likes to dress up at times as a clown, of all things. During your time with this man, you guys discussed employment opportunities, pay, expectations, previous experience, and all of the regular things you may expect you would discuss during a job interview. The interview comes to a close and you feel optimistic, hoping that you're gonna get a job soon and potentially start a lifelong career, when the man you've been sitting across the table with asks you if you want to see a cool trick. You don't want to be rude, so you go with it, and he invites you into his basement. In the basement, he shows you handcuffs, and you're interested and kind of confused. Where did you get these? Are these real? How do they work? He doesn't really explain, but he says, put them on, I'm gonna show you something. So once again, almost hesitantly, you go with it. You allow him to handcuff you, and then he shows you that he has the keys, but not in a reassuring way, almost in a taunting sort of way. At this point, the vibe shifts immediately, and the professional man that you were just talking to upstairs is now a creepy and demented seeming individual who, at the drop of a hat, switched. The man who you thought would become your boss is now picking up a hammer, and he is now becoming the last thing you would ever see. That man was John Wayne Gacy. We're really 3 for 3 in this video because John Wayne Gacy, like Jeffrey Dahmer and like Ted Bundy, was a very unassuming person who also committed most of his crimes in the 70s, which is an interesting overlap as well. I wonder if there was something in the water, but who knows? John Wayne Gacy lived in the northern suburbs of Chicago and owned a successful construction company and was a seemingly loyal father and husband to his second wife and 2 stepdaughters. He even attended church and was active in the Polish community. Gacy was also involved in the Democratic Party and through that had some interesting connections. Connections that I'm assuming now wish they had nothing to do with Gacy. Gacy was known, like I mentioned in the story, for throwing block parties, inviting the police, neighbors, and anybody in the community who wanted to celebrate, enjoy food, and even see a clown perform some tricks. That clown being Pogo the Clown, which was Gacy's alter ego. But even in this condition, in the northern suburbs of Chicago, living a seemingly nice life, before anything was ever found out, before he was ever caught for his 32 murders, he already had a dark and shadowy past. Gacy was previously arrested for assaulting 2 young men in Iowa. And if that's not crazy enough, this was also the exact same time when his first wife was giving birth to his child. Literally insane. For these crimes in Iowa, Gacy was caught and served time in prison. He was sentenced to 10 years but only got 18 months and was released on parole. So technically that was the first time Gacy was caught, but that's not the only time he was caught, so let's keep going. It was after this release from prison when Gacy divorced his first wife and moved to Chicago, where now we're up to speed. From the outside, it seemed that Gacy was living a great and rather successful life, but that couldn't be further from the truth. His marriage was falling apart after telling his wife that he was bisexual and wanting to get men involved in their relations, and their divorce left Gacy a lot of free time to indulge in his fantasies. On December 7th, 1976, a young man named Robert who was working at a pharmacy stayed after work to talk to a man who said that he could have a construction job available for him. Sound familiar? Gacy offered to pay him double what he was making. An interesting proposal to anybody. This young pharmacist obviously was never seen again. And worst of all, while Robert was meeting with Gacy, his mom was outside waiting for him to finish work and to drive him home, as she was his ride and she was gonna take him home so they could spend time together, as it was his mom's birthday. Once again, horrible timing. Fortunately, in this situation, the police weren't completely oblivious. And almost immediately after this case was brought to the police were already suspecting something was up with Gacy, specifically because they knew about his past, and one of the detectives on this case even called Gacy directly. Although, to be fair, one of Gacy's own employees went missing, and when people begged the police to investigate Gacy then, which was only a year prior, those requests were ignored. If you really want to be mad, in 1977, a young man went to the police station and reported that Gacy had kidnapped him and threatened him with a gun. And when questioned, Gacy admitted to the entire situation, but said that it was consensual and that this man was lying. And the police sided with Gacy in this situation, and he was let off. I know. Crazy. I didn't mean for this video to be a compilation of horrible police work, but that's definitely becoming a common theme. Back to the Rob situation. After the investigation continued, the police were able to get a search warrant for Gacy after he was late for the interview that they requested of him. Gacy reluctantly gave his keys to the police, and he was held at the station while they searched his home. The police found a receipt for a roll of film that Rob had owned, proving that Rob had been in Gacy's house. And they also found a ring that another lost boy was missing. Although they weren't able to charge him with anything with these facts, they were able to put him under surveillance, but they did have to let him go at this point in time. Strangely, while under surveillance, Gacy invited the two police officers watching him into his house and offered them coffee. These officers noticed a horrible smell inside the house, a smell that a police officer would definitely recognize. The smell of death. But still, this wasn't the end quite yet. Days later, while still obviously under surveillance, Gacy was caught selling weed to a gas station employee, where he was arrested and once again interrogated, where detectives had more ammo to interrogate him with, and they threatened to literally rip up his floorboards if he did not tell the truth, which they obviously meant hypothetically, but physically they did end up doing that and finding exactly what they were looking for. While in jail, he did admit to killing one person, but claimed it was only self-defense. Gacy led police to the place in his basement where he hid one body, and upon further investigation, the police found a trapdoor where they found at least 3 other bodies. When this information was shared with Gacy and Gacy knew the jig was up, he went on a multi-hour-long rant, speaking in the third person like a lunatic, admitting to everything, and claimed that he had killed at least 32 young men and boys, and that 27 of them were buried on his property. In April of 1979, a grand jury indicted Gacy on a total of 33 murders, which at that point in history was the largest number of murders associated with one person. While in custody, Gacy admitted to more and more gruesome details about his murders, and the police were able to validate all of these stories by finding evidence within his home. On February 6, 1980, Gacy pled not guilty to all of the charges, and his lawyers tried to pull a insanity card, but that didn't work. Gacy was of course found guilty and sentenced to death. After 15 years on death row, Gacy was killed by lethal injection on May 10th, 1994. But there you have it. 3 of the most infamous serial killers and how they got caught. Every person currently on the FBI's most wanted list. Chances are you've heard about the FBI's most wanted list at some point in your life. It's also likely that you don't know much about it besides the fact that it's a list of criminals. Well, I was in the same boat, so I did some research. And today I'm going to explain a brief history about the FBI's most wanted list, and then take a deep dive into every single person who's on the list and why they're there. Spoiler alert, these are some bad people. The most wanted list was actually born in 1949, when the director of the FBI was at dinner with the chief and editor of the International News Service, as they were discussing ways to promote and capture the FBI's toughest guys. The FBI wanted to use the newspaper to spread awareness to civilians to get more tips to help arm law enforcement with information. Shortly after this meeting, the list was published, and that very same day, one of the members that was on the initial list was caught. And from that point on, the FBI's most wanted list has been a staple when it comes to high-level justice. To be eligible to even be put on the FBI's most wanted list, you have to do some terrible things. And in most cases, you have to have a long history or a string of multiple things under your belt. Some examples of which we're gonna get into today. Oh, and the only ways to be removed from this list are being captured or dying. So take your pick. Alejandro Castillo. It's crazy that the first entry on this list is the youngest entry by far. Alejandro was only born in 1998 on November 26th, making him only 26 years old at the time of this recording. He was born in Arizona and is currently 5'6" and weighs anywhere from 180 to 190 pounds. He is male and Hispanic, and what landed him on this list may shock you. When Alejandro was only 17 years old, he was working at a Shomar's restaurant in Charlotte, North Carolina. He worked at this restaurant with his girlfriend. But not only his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend also worked there as well. Alejandro's ex-girlfriend, Sandy, lent him some money, but unfortunately, she went missing before he could pay her back. But even stranger is the day after that Sandy, his ex-girlfriend, went missing, both Alejandro and his current girlfriend went missing as well. But although they all went missing, Alejandro and his girlfriend were no victims. They simply were on the run. What happened was the night before his ex-girlfriend Sandy went missing, Alejandro and Sandy had plans of meeting up so Alejandro could repay his debt, although that was never his intention. When the two met up, Alejandro and his girlfriend forced Sandy to get in the vehicle, and it was at that point when Alejandro's girlfriend held a gun to Sandy and they drove to the nearest ATM where she withdrew money. After this, they drove deep into the woods and Alejandro murdered his ex-girlfriend and left her body in a ditch. Alejandro's car was found abandoned a little bit outside of town, likely dumped by the murderers. But oddly enough, Sandy's car was found all the way in Arizona, basically on the opposite side of the country, where it was also abandoned. It was this discovery that allowed them to find surveillance footage of Alejandro and his girlfriend crossing the border into Mexico, where they currently reside. At least Alejandro still does. 3 months after they disappeared into Mexico, Alejandro's girlfriend actually turned herself in. Alejandro's girlfriend claims that one morning she woke up and Alejandro was simply gone, and with nothing else to do, she decided to turn herself in. And whether he simply abandoned her or she's telling a lie to cover his tracks, we may never know. But Alejandro, the 17-year-old murderer who's now 26, is still at large. Donald Eugene Fields II. Donald definitely looks like somebody who would be on this list. He was born on July 9th, 1964, is anywhere from 6 to 6 feet 4 tall. He's a white male and has a scar on his chest and a few tattoos as well. Fields is on this list for an extremely unsavory reason. He's alleged to have trafficked at least one child in Missouri from approximately 2013 to 2017. It is believed that Donald was knowingly attempting to recruit, entice, harbor, transport, provide, maintain, and solicit a person who he believed to be under the age of 18 years old. To put it in regular speak, he was essentially trying to sell a child for sex. His last known location is Franklin County, Missouri, but he's been reported to have been traveling around the country since 2022. Fortunately, one of the people that Fields was selling this underage person to was caught and sentenced to over 30 years in prison, and he even admitted to giving cash, a car, a motorcycle, Christmas presents, and vacations in exchange for access to this 14-year-old that Fields was soliciting. Every time the FBI gets a tip about him, they are putting up billboards, signs, and Facebook ads in the city to get any information. But unfortunately, it seems that Fields is typically one step ahead, although I hope he is brought to justice very soon. Vitel Homme Innocent. Ironically, Vitel's last name literally translates to innocent man in French, but this man is far from innocent. Vitel is one of the leaders of Haiti's largest and most violent gangs. Besides his affiliation with a gang that has been terrorizing Haiti for years, Vitel is also personally connected to a string of murders and kidnappings. In 2021, Vitel and his gang collaborated with another gang to kidnap 17 Christian missionaries that were currently in Haiti. And if this sounds familiar, you've probably heard of the story before when it was happening because it was pretty high profile. Disturbingly, out of all of these hostages, 5 of them were children, one of them being under 1 year old. But fortunately, they were all safely returned after this surely traumatic experience, after somebody paid an undisclosed amount of money. Initially, these gangs wanted $1 million per person, but who knows what they settled for. After this ransom was paid, Vitel's gang used this money to fund buying weapons, and later that year, the Haitian president was murdered, leaving a massive power vacuum and an opportunity for Vitel's gang to gain massive power in Haiti. In 2023, it's reported that this gang has up to 600 members, including children who are fighting against their will. Interestingly, Vitel offers a strange perspective into the life of crime in Haiti, whereas last year he actually did a full documentary with reporters where he showed off his lifestyle and even spoke to reporters about how he came to power and what his lifestyle is currently like. It goes without saying that Vitel is considered armed and extremely dangerous. For Vitel, the FBI is offering $2 million for anybody who can offer information leading to his arrest. But I think based on the brief that I gave about Vitel, it's understandable why this price is so high. And I also think it's no wonder how he's still on the loose today. Wilver Villegas Palomino. Wilver is a high-ranking member of the National Liberation Army, or ELN for short, which is a military movement which is active primarily in Colombia and Venezuela. ELN, similar to Craze Barry, the gang owned by Vitel, deals primarily with organized crime, specifically kidnapping, extortion, and even attacking oil infrastructure, basically eco-terrorism. And shortly after, in true Colombian fashion, got involved in the drug trade. Wilver personally is alleged to have killed multiple human rights activists in Colombia, as well as committing narco-terrorism, distribution of drugs, kidnappings, murder, and other similar charges. Wolver and his gang of ELN is heavily attributed to the massive influx of drugs into the southern states in the USA. And for that reason, the FBI is offering up to $5 million for any information that can help bring him to justice. Currently, there is absolutely no information available about where Wolver may reside. Although, if you have any clue, you might be $5 million richer. Ruja Ignatova. Although this person is definitely not a good person, compared to some of the other people in this list, Ruja is going to seem like a petty thief. Ruja is a Bulgarian woman, and she was an entrepreneur, or so she was believed to be. Ruja was the founder of OneCoin Limited, which was a Bulgaria-based company that was marketing and purporting cryptocurrency. I'm sure as soon as it said cryptocurrency, you saw where this was going. OneCoin was defrauding billions of dollars from their investors all over the world. And in order to make her scheme as big as it was and go on as long as it was, Ruja was allegedly making false statements and representations to individuals in order to solicit more investments in OneCoin. Basically, more or less of your run-of-the-mill Ponzi scheme, and very similar to what happened recently with FTX, which was another huge cryptocurrency scandal. Throughout the entirety of its scheme, OneCoin is believed to have defrauded over $4 billion out of investors, which is insane. Ruja's company was officially charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, and securities fraud. And currently, Ruja is on the run. On October 12th, 2017, Ruja was charged in the United States District Court, and today they were offering up to $5 million for any information that leads to her arrest or conviction. Note to self, do not buy into cryptocurrency pyramid schemes. I'm not anti-crypto, but I'm definitely anti-scam, and OneCoin was a huge scam. Arnaldo Jimenez. This man is absolutely vile, as is everybody on this list, but the specific details of this story just made me feel gross. On May 11th, 2012, Arnaldo got married to his wife, and only one day later, on May 12th, Arnaldo is alleged with murdering his wife by stabbing her to death in the back of his Maserati. He's alleged to, at that point, taken her dead body from his vehicle and putting her in the bathtub of her apartment, where he left her and then seemingly vanished. When Arnaldo's wife was not replying to any of her family's calls or texts and didn't pick up her children from school, her family called the police, where they did a wellness check and found her body in her tub, still in her wedding dress. Arnaldo is believed to be somewhere in Mexico, but unfortunately after 12 years and hundreds of tips, nothing has brought the FBI any closer to bringing this man to justice. After the murder, phone records were able to trace Arnaldo across multiple states across the country and even ended with him in Texas, extremely close to the Mexican border. But unfortunately, that's where the records ended, and once he entered Mexico, there has been absolutely no sightings of him. Hopefully, Arnaldo was caught and serves life in prison for the crimes he's committed. But from what we've seen so far on this list, it seems that going to Mexico is a pretty good way to avoid jail time. Omar Alexander Cardenas. Omar's case is short and simple, but no less disturbing, as he is charged with murdering a man in broad daylight, with footage of him walking to and waddling away from the place where he committed this murder. Omar is another young entry on this list, being only 29 years old at the time of recording this video, and even younger when this crime happened. And while his crime is essentially caught on camera, not much is known about him, besides the fact that he's 5'7" and 300 pounds, which is a crazy build. On August 15th, 2019, Omar walked to an open-air shopping center where he stood in front of a barbershop, pulled a pistol out of his pants, and shot at the head of one of the people in the barbershop, who he instantly killed and then seemingly just casually walked away. With how brazen this murder was and the fact that it was in public, in broad daylight, and even caught on camera, to me it's honestly crazy that this man is still walking free today. Being a most wanted criminal has allowed the FBI to get a lot more tips and information about this individual, but unfortunately nothing has been able to help them find him. Likely because, like others on this list, he too fled the country to avoid prosecution. Yulan Adonai Archaga Carrales. MS-13 is one of the most violent criminal organizations in the world, active primarily in South America, specifically Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, but currently are active in Mexico and the United States as well. Yulan here is the alleged leader of the MS-13 in all of Honduras, making him responsible for a lot of shenanigans, to say the least, such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, and extreme acts of violence. Yulan specifically is wanted in the US for trafficking multi-ton loads of cocaine into the United States, as well as murder and a laundry list of others. Crazily, Yulan was actually apprehended and charged in court for the murder of 2 Honduras prosecutors, when during his trial, 20 armed men dressed in the same uniforms as the anti-gang unit walk into the court hearing and seconds after unload on the entire room. 4 police officers were killed, and Yulan was once again a free man. The power that these criminal organizations have in South America is honestly scary and strongly rivals the government, although some would argue that the two are intertwined. Although this man is only 5'5" and 160 pounds, he's one of the most powerful and deadly men in Honduras and likely in all of South America. And it's not necessarily shocking that the FBI is willing to offer up to $5 million for information leading to the conviction or arrest of Yulan. Alexis Flores. Alexis is another man from Honduras, although he is even shorter and smaller than the previous entry. He stands at a staggering 5'4" tall and weighs only 130 pounds. But his alleged crime is absolutely sickening. To put it bluntly, Alexis Flores is alleged to have kidnapped and strangled to death a 5-year-old girl in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This young girl was reported missing in July of 2000 and was found a few weeks later lifeless in the basement of an abandoned apartment building in August of 2000. Unfortunately, for this crime, there is little to no evidence, and the case went cold for multiple years. The only piece of evidence they had was a strange t-shirt. It wasn't until 7 years later in 2007 when DNA analysis advancements were far enough along where they were successfully able to find a matching DNA sample to someone that they arrested years prior for shoplifting and forgery. They finally had a lead and a perfect DNA match, closely linking this criminal to at least the owner of this t-shirt, which was directly at the crime scene. Although when they found out who this t-shirt belonged to, they had a whole new problem that they had to solve. They knew they had their guy, Alexis Flores, but when searching the database, they also saw that Alexis Flores was no longer in the United States. Alexis was actually deported years prior for other unrelated charges, and unfortunately, the authorities had no idea where he was. It's pretty shocking how somebody can do something once again so brazen in broad daylight and have absolutely nobody report or see anything, at least anything that was able to bring him to justice. Bhadresh Kumar Chetanbhai Patel. Ladies and gentlemen, before we get into the disgusting actions of the last person on the FBI's most wanted list, I just wanted to mention two quick things. When doing research for this video, I not only researched those who are currently on this list, but I also made a list of some of the most infamous people that have ever been on this list that has existed for over 70 years. And although YouTube doesn't necessarily love videos on these topics, if you guys want that video, I'd be more than happy to make a video about the most infamous people to ever be on the list. So leave a like or leave a comment letting me know you'd be interested in that video. And while the FBI most wanted list is definitely the most famous list, there is also another list full of dangerous criminals. That list is the US Marshals most wanted list, and they currently have 15 extremely dangerous criminals listed on there. So if either of those videos are something that you'd want to see, I'd be more than happy to cover. Just let me know by leaving a like or a comment. Now let's proceed with our final entry. Bhadresh Kumar shares a very similar and disturbing similarity to the first entry on this list. Bhadresh Kumar and Alejandro both worked at restaurants with their significant others. Bhadresh Kumar worked at a Dunkin' Donuts with his wife, and it's at that same Dunkin' Donuts where Bhadresh Kumar's wife would pass away. Customers entered this Dunkin' Donuts and called police after realizing that there was no employees at the store whatsoever. And once police entered the store, they checked in the back and found a lifeless employee, this employee being the wife of Bhadresh Kumar. Security footage pointed obviously to Bhadresh Kumar murdering his wife, as there was footage of both of them stepping in the back room and only Bhadresh Kumar leaving the back room before he fled the scene. Bhadresh Kumar was last seen taking a taxi from a hotel in New Jersey to a train station in Newark, where he hasn't been seen or heard from since. Hence why the FBI was so eager to put him on this list, as without any information or tips, this man is walking the streets free, and nobody wants that. After doing research for this video, I have two pretty crazy takeaways, and I want to know yours as well. To me, it seems so crazy that some people can just get away with such brazen and crazy crimes. And it also seems extremely saddening how simply going to Mexico can be a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you happen to know anything about some of these people, drop a tip at the FBI, and you might just be a little bit richer. How the most notorious serial killers were caught. The year is 1888, and you are located in Whitechapel, England, one of the roughest areas in London's East End. You, like most of the people in your life and in Whitechapel, don't live a life of luxury at all. You struggle to make ends meet, and tonight don't even have the 2 pence to pay for a place to sleep. You used to have a more or less picturesque life until your husband died, and since being on your own, like many women at the time, you resorted to selling your body. Whitechapel wasn't a booming metropolitan area, but it did contain over 62 brothels and over 1,200 prostitutes at the time. So to you, it was a better option than starving. With nowhere else to go, you spent the last few hours at the pub you frequented, and as the pub began to close, the bartender sensed that you weren't able to pay your bill. Unfortunately, they told you tonight it was on the house, as they knew you had fallen onto some tough times. You stumble out of this bar, beyond drunk, into the dark labyrinth that is the Whitechapel streets, and you begin to take the long and ominous walk home. At this time, it had to be at least 2 or 3 in the morning. The street was so dimly lit and the fog was so thick, you could barely see a person standing a few feet in front of you. Luckily, the labyrinth of small roads was something you were more than familiar with and could do with your eyes closed. And while there was nobody on this street beside yourself, you do notice a figure in the distance, something that you knew wasn't typically there. It wasn't a lamppost and it wasn't an animal. As you get closer, you realize that it's a man in a dark trench coat and tall hat. As your drunken thoughts begin to process what you're looking at, you realize that this man was your golden ticket. You had just possibly found a place to stay tonight and even a way to make a few dollars. And as you approach this man, you try to put yourself together and approach him confidently. You walk right up to him and tell him that if he's looking for a good time, you can both go back to his place, and before you could even finish your offer, you slowly notice this man developing an unnatural smirk. And before you're even fully able to process this unnerving smile, you notice something. The reflection of what streetlight was available twinkled off of an object that this man just pulled out of his pocket, although it wasn't a pocket watch or change. This man had just pulled out a 7-inch knife. You instantly realize you need to run away as soon as possible, but your alcohol-induced delayed reaction time prevented you from taking any action, and the only thing you could do was let out a gasp before this man raises the knife and cuts your existence short. Only a few hours later, at the very crack of dawn, a man is slowly venturing down a cobblestone road when he sees something on the sidewalk. He notices a woman on the sidewalk. Although this wasn't the typical Whitechapel homeless person, this was a woman face down, surrounded by blood. This man instantly gets out of his buggy, flips this woman over, only to realize that this woman was not only injured, but brutally murdered. Her neck was stabbed multiple times, and her torso was not only stabbed, but mutilated, with her intestines almost spilling out of her torso. This grim and disgusting discovery was one of the many victims of Jack the Ripper, and the start of a hunt for truth that would last over 137 years. There's no doubt that Jack the Ripper is one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious serial killer of all time. And of course, we're going to discuss exactly how he was caught. But before we discuss how he was caught, it's important to understand exactly how he wasn't caught so long ago. Obviously, technology wasn't nearly advanced as it was now, but that doesn't mean that crimes weren't solved. And in the case of Jack the Ripper, there was plenty of situations where Jack was very close to being caught and truthfully should have been caught, but we'll get to that. One of the biggest factors that consistently contributed to Jack the Ripper being able to go on for so long without being identified was the location of where he lived. As I mentioned earlier, Whitechapel was a rough area, and although it was tight and crowded, people weren't necessarily paying attention to others as they had enough to focus on. And weird things going on weren't so weird there. People shouting in the streets, people sleeping in the streets, people fighting, people with blood on their clothes, all weren't necessarily uncommon in a place where people were struggling to survive, dealing with disease, violence, and crime, and truthfully just trying to make it to their next meal, let alone their own next day. This gave Jack a lot of leeway to commit some truly horrendous crimes as long as he wasn't directly in anybody's eyesight. Another major contributing factor to the reason why he wasn't caught at the time is because he was only active for a few years. Obviously, being an active serial killer for any period of time is unacceptable. However, if you've seen any of our videos on serial killers, you would know that some killers are active for decades. At the time, it wasn't known how long Jack the Ripper was active, as his identity was unknown. Although, with the information that we have now, we can pinpoint exactly when he stopped killing and why he did too. But before we discuss that, let's first discuss how Jack the Ripper even earned a name as a serial killer. This brings us back to our initial story. A woman being found dead in the Whitechapel streets wasn't common, but wasn't unheard of. But what was unheard of was the sheer level of mutilation that occurred on her body. If this happened only once, there would be no Jack the Ripper. But the volume and consistency of these attacks in such a short amount of time were what fueled the media to create a monster, and one of the first ever famous serial killers. In 1888 alone, there is 5 confirmed killings associated with Jack the Ripper. These 5 victims are known as the canonical 5. And the reason these 5 victims are confirmed to be victims of Jack the Ripper are because they all exhibit trademarks of Jack's method of murder. All of these 5 women were either underprivileged, vulnerable, or had recently fallen onto hard times. And most notably, all of these victims had been murdered and brutally mutilated in such a specific manner. But it wasn't mutilation alone that created Jack the Ripper's signature murder. It was how precise and consistent these mutilations were. Coroners and doctors who inspected these victims once they were found would all remark that whoever had done this must have been experienced with a knife in some way, whether they were a doctor or a butcher or a shoemaker. And during the time that these murders were being investigated in the late 1800s, people in those exact professions, among others, were questioned, as whoever was wielding this knife and mutilating these women was no amateur. And that is beyond unsettling. As these murders were first first being discovered, people believed that there was multiple murderers on the loose, as people were being killed more than ever, and these murders were happening so close to each other. And for 2 of the canonical 5 victims of Jack the Ripper, they were even murdered in the same night, 45 minutes apart from each other. And for that fact, it's reasonable to assume that it might have been multiple people. However, like I mentioned, the sheer consistency of these mutilations made it hard to believe there was more than one person. And with every murder, the newspaper was feeding more and more into the story that a monster was on the loose. Obviously, the newspapers covered these strange murders to keep locals up to date on what was happening, although some speculate that the newspaper was pushing the story for ulterior motives as well. The name Jack the Ripper didn't come from the police or from the public. It was a name that was referenced in a letter that was sent to the media from somebody claiming to be the murderer. That letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, at that time and until today was considered to be a hoax. However, Jack the Ripper must have gotten word about this hoax and decided to confirm things once and for all, as shortly after the Dear Boss letter was submitted to the media, another letter was submitted to the media, known as the From Hell letter. However, this letter was more convincing, as it wasn't just a written statement from somebody claiming that they were the murderer. It was a letter that stated that it was from the murderer and proved it by including half of a kidney in the letter. This half kidney was from one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And it was at that point when the newspaper and the general public knew that they had one deranged individual on their hands. And it was also that letter that launched Jack the Ripper from local terror to nationwide and later global infamy. Up until last year, that's basically where the story would have ended. Jack the Ripper was never caught, his identity was never known, and he was somebody that truly terrorized not only his city, but the world. That was until recently. In 2007, a self-proclaimed Jack the Ripper expert named Russell Edwards bought a shawl. But it wasn't any shawl. He wasn't upgrading his wardrobe. He bought a shawl that was believed to have been owned by one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. And not only that, but this shawl was also present at a murder scene and was likely to have DNA on it. And it was this purchase that led to one of the biggest cold cases being solved in almost 150 years. Edwards gave this shawl that he had purchased to a biochemist and tasked him with finding any DNA possible. And that's exactly what he did. And only a few years later, a peer-reviewed article on the DNA analysis that the biochemist was able to find was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. The article that this biochemist published claimed exactly what Russell Edwards had written about all the way back in 2014, that Jack the Ripper was a man named Aaron Kosminski. And while this article has been criticized by scientists for making misassumptions, it does make a pretty compelling case, and at the very least provides a bit more context to the entire Jack the Ripper situation. Aaron Kosminski was born on September 11th, 1865 in Poland, but emigrated to England in the 1880s. He lived in Whitechapel in the East End of London, and his occupation was a barber or hairdresser. That alone is interesting because that confirms that Aaron Kosminski was in the area of the Jack the Ripper killings when they happened, and he also was in a profession that wasn't a stranger to sharp objects. But the information gets deeper. In 1891, Kosminski was institutionalized after he threatened his own sister with a knife. Coincidentally, 1891 was the same year that the suspected Jack the Ripper killings stopped happening. Aaron Kosminski spent the rest of his life institutionalized, and while information about his time in these sanitariums is relatively undocumented or at least deeply archived, it is documented that he did suffer with severe schizophrenia, leaving him very troubled. Which is also interesting because the things that Jack the Ripper did would, in my opinion, only be the result of somebody who was truly disturbed. But on top of all of these similarities and coincidences, the biggest claim of the article submitted by the biochemist that Russell Edwards had commissioned was that they claimed to have a DNA link between Aaron Kosminski and DNA found on the shawl of the Jack the Ripper victim. It was actually a 100% DNA match. And that piece of evidence alone was the nail in the coffin, and what sparked a lot of the news you likely saw this year of Jack the Ripper's identity finally being revealed. Over the years, there's been a handful of interesting theories about who Jack the Ripper truly was, but I think the argument that it was Aaron Kosminski is definitely the most compelling. But with that being said, was Jack the Ripper ever truly caught? Well, if Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, then his identity was revealed, which means something. But also, if it was Aaron Kosminski, that does mean that he was institutionalized in 1891 for the rest of his life, meaning that he was imprisoned not for his crimes, but for his illness. His illness that likely sparked these crimes. So although you could argue Jack the Ripper was still not 1000% confirmed, I do think that there is a strong argument that Aaron Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. And for that reason, I do believe he was caught. But even if you don't agree, I think this story is extremely interesting and adds, if nothing else, new layers to one of the coldest cases in serial killer history. But this is only the first case of 3 that we're covering in this video, so let me summarize. How exactly did Jack the Ripper get caught? According to the evidence we have, he got caught because he was consistently killing, he killed in a very methodical way, he confirmed he was a man acting alone in a letter he wrote to the media, and that letter not only confirmed that he was one person, but also gave the media ammo to create this spectacle that was Jack the Ripper. And it was this spectacle that got him caught. Because if the media didn't make Jack the Ripper the big boogeyman that he was, there would not be Jack the Ripper historians in the modern day. And if there was no Jack the Ripper in the modern day, there would be no collector buying this old shawl that was at the scene of the crime, and there would be nobody to give it to a biochemist to check it for DNA. And it's interesting to think, if Jack the Ripper never had written that letter, would we be talking about him today? And would he have ever been caught? I guess we'll never know. But let's move on. Saturday, August 24th, 1985. You are a 13-year-old boy, and you had just returned home to Southern California from a road trip with your family. The road trip was fun, but the entire time there was an eerie undertone, as your parents and the family you had been visiting out of town were all focused on one subject: the serial killer that had been on the loose in Southern California. You didn't know much of the situation, and truthfully, you weren't too interested, but you overheard your parents talking about some sort of night stalker. And between overhearing your parents and news coverage, it was hard not to have some sort of context about what was going on. And from what you understood, there was this crazy man on the loose who at this point had killed 13 innocent people, and was still not only not caught, but not even identified. This, to you, was scary. But what was about to happen on this fateful night was going to be a lot scarier. You return home from your family vacation later in the night, and you spent the evening unpacking, something that you delayed doing because you were watching your favorite VHS. It was a movie known as Back to the Future, and it only came out a month prior. And watching this movie kept you up later than usual. And this movie left you excited and unable to sleep, which is why you were up at midnight, which for you was later than usual. The rest of your family was sleeping, so you made sure to be quiet and keep to yourself. It was until you realized that you left your favorite pillow in the family RV, and you weren't going to bed without it, so you had to quietly sneak out to it to get it, obviously without waking your parents. You tiptoe outside, and once you make it into the yard, you hear something that sounds like footsteps, but you're not alarmed. You have a large backyard that's unfenced that backs onto a hill, and seeing possums, raccoons, and even deer weren't necessarily uncommon. And you were curious to see what was making all of this noise. You don't see any animal or anything at all, and figure whatever little critter it was must have scurried away. And since you're outside, you figured, why not go to the garage and work on your bike a little bit? Back to the Future got you inspired to tinker around, and maybe you were about to build the first time-traveling bike. And it was shortly into this tinkering session that you once again heard footsteps. But this time it was different. There was no suspicion of this being an animal. You were certain that you were hearing a person walking around the property. Your biggest fear was that your dad was coming out to see what you were up to, but what was actually outside was much more terrifying. It only took a few moments for you to realize that whoever was outside wasn't your dad, because they didn't enter the garage and they didn't say anything. You had an odd feeling and decided to hide behind the car and realized that you couldn't be here. You bolted out of the garage directly into the house, and as soon as you got into the house, you looked out the window to see exactly what was outside. And that's when you see a man walking around your home. You see this man start to walk away, and before he fully leaves your property, you want to get one last look to see if you know who this man could be and what he was doing there. And as you run from your bedroom out through the kitchen to the garage, your dad stops you in the kitchen and asks you, what are you doing? Why are you up at this hour? Hastily, you tell your dad that there's a man in the yard and you need to see who he is and what he's doing now. And after explaining this entire situation in only a matter of seconds, you shove your dad out of the way and run into the yard, when you catch a glimpse of a figure wearing a baseball cap, a jacket, and blue jeans. And although you can't identify this figure, you see them get into an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack. As this man got into his car, you run into the road to follow him. And although his car is facing the opposite direction to you, he doesn't just drive off. He does a U-turn in the middle of the road to go the opposite direction. And this gives you the opportunity to see this man's face. The man drove off, and you, confused, go back inside and explain everything to your dad. Concerned, your dad already had the police called, and rather swiftly, the police were at the door taking a written statement. But it was only an hour later when the police called back to get even more information. And then a few hours later, at 6 in the morning, the police once once again returned for more information. And the reason why the police returned at 6 in the morning was because only a mile and a half away from your home, there was another mysterious murder. And it happened only shortly after your initial report was made. And it was at that point when everything had clicked. Initially, you and your parents assumed that there must have been some sort of potential burglar lurking in the yard that was scared away when he saw that people were up. But once the police had confirmed that there was a murder only a mile from your home, they suspected that you didn't find a burglar, but that you likely came face to face with Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. 2 days later, on August 27th, 1985, the police identified a vehicle that matched the description that you had given them. It was an orange Toyota hatchback with a chrome roof rack parked on the side of the road. The police had this car towed and impounded, likely to provoke the owner to show up to reclaim it and then to be investigated. When the police towed this car, they asked you, "Is this the car that you saw that night?" And you confirmed it. And the reason why they towed this car initially is because on the night when they took their official statement, you told them that you saw this exact car. And you even remembered the first few digits of the license plate. This alone was a huge breakthrough in the case, and was one of the major turning points that got Richard Ramirez caught. Once the vehicle was confirmed to be the one that they saw that night, police investigated the entire vehicle, finding very little evidence. That was until they found a single fingerprint on the driver's side mirror, a fingerprint that linked the driver of the vehicle to Richard Ramirez. And at that point, a photo and name was submitted to the public as a person of interest. And it was at that point when the floodgates on this case burst open. One day after the name and photo were submitted to the public, on August 31st, 1985, Richard Ramirez was trying to steal a vehicle. And while attempting to steal this vehicle, an altercation broke out, and this altercation got the attention of neighbors. And although Ramirez was able to get car keys from a woman that he had just assaulted, before he could drive away with his vehicle he had attempted to steal, a neighbor had pulled Ramirez out of the vehicle, and other neighbors at this point had also approached the vehicle and began to beat and restrain Ramirez. The police were called, showed up, and arrested the man. And 1 week later, the police called you one final time to identify the person you saw that night in a lineup. You looked at 5 criminals standing beside each other, and you instantly recognized the man who you saw in your backyard. You tell the police that that was the man you saw that night, and it was your testimony that led to the Night Stalker being caught once and for all. The boy in the story that identified Ramirez is known as James Ramiro, and he is truly one brave young man. Not even a young man, he's like 13, he's literally a boy, like a child. And perhaps him being so naive allowed him to have the confidence and the blissful ignorance to follow a mysterious man into your backyard in the middle of the night. As a grown man, I wouldn't do that alone, even if I was armed. Regardless, James being up late that night and deciding to follow this man to the yard ultimately led to the downfall of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history, and undoubtedly saved the lives of innocent people that Richard Ramirez would have victimized next. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges and was sentenced to death. His convictions specifically were 12 counts of first-degree murder, 11 counts of second-degree murder, and 14 counts of first-degree burglary. And although he was on death row, he died on June 7th, 2013 at the age of 53 of lymphoma. I think the story kind of tells itself here. James was an absolute legend of a boy, and Ramirez was a troubled excuse for a man. And although Ramirez was unfortunately able to victimize so many innocent people, justice was at least eventually served, largely in part to James. So exactly how did the Night Stalker get caught? Well, he messed with the wrong boy staying up past his bedtime. The year is 1998. You live in a small town in England known as Hyde, and you have recently been going through some distressing times with your family. Your father-in-law has been experiencing very odd medical symptoms, and it's believed that he may have cancer. Obviously, wanting the best, you and your family decide to go to one of the most respected and well-known doctors in the entire city of Hyde, a man named Harold Shipman. Your father-in-law gets an examination, and a few days later, you call him to follow up on the prognosis. The doctor on the phone rather firmly responds, "I wouldn't buy him any Easter eggs," which was a harsh way of delivering news that someone was going to die soon. Almost eerie, as Easter was only 2 weeks away. Due to the shock of the news you've just received, you appreciate him telling you the truth, and you hang up the phone and begin talking to your family. Your family took this news a little bit softer, as they believed that he was being metaphorical and almost joking, saying that the end was soon, but there was no way that it could have been this soon, right? Regardless, your family started to make the appropriate plans. And almost on cue, only 4 days later after that phone call, even earlier than the doctor had claimed, your father-in-law had passed away. The truth behind his death was a lot more disturbing than simply him succumbing to the disease he had. You meet with the doctor after your father-in-law's passing to discuss if anything could have been done and what really happened and why this was so sudden. And the doctor, rather sternly yet calmly and somewhat compassionately, described to you that sometimes things happen so fast, and realistically in situations with terminal illness, there's not much you can do. This doctor tells you that an autopsy isn't required and that you should plan the funeral as soon as possible to begin the grieving process. And like many others before you take his advice and opt to not have an autopsy. This practice was common for Harold Shipman, as he not only advocated for all of his patients who had family members who passed away to not only not get an autopsy, but also to get a cremation as fast as possible. But as you likely already know, these recommendations weren't coming from a place of compassion, but instead out of a place of self-preservation. And the reason why I say this is because Harold Shipman was actively killing his patients. He targeted typically elderly women and sometimes elderly men too, and for the most part victimized people who were already terminally ill and unlikely to be suspected of accidental or intentional death. Harold was a troubled individual, there was no doubt about it. His mother passed away at a young age, and he struggled with drug abuse in his early career as a doctor and was even admitted to a facility. However, it wasn't put on his record and he was only given a warning. This allowed him to continue practicing and even to get his own private practice, which may sound like a fortunate second chance, although that optimism slips away when you realize what happened within his private practice. Harold was no longer addicted to heroin, but he was seemingly addicted to giving his target patients a lethal dose of diamorphine, the same drug that was given to his mother when she was dying. Harold Shipman was suspected of killing his victims as early as 1975, and it wasn't until 1998 when suspicions of foul play began to become overwhelming. As in small communities, word spreads quickly, and it was at that point when Harold Shipman was investigated. Upon investigation, it was confirmed that Harold Shipman's mortality rate as a doctor was 10 times above the average. Yet, when the health authority investigated all of the paperwork associated with these patients and their deaths, they found no irregularities, which at the time lowered suspicion. But as we know now, these papers were actually forged to fit the stories that he was spinning. And while the health authority was investigating the patients, the Greater Manchester Police were investigating Shipman, and unfortunately also failed, as they weren't even able to find his criminal history or the time he spent in an institution for his drug abuse. What this essentially means is that this first investigation into Harold Shipman almost cleared his name. It didn't clear suspicions, but legally speaking, Harold was doing nothing wrong. He was a standard doctor who unfortunately had some unlucky clients. But this story didn't last for long. Only a few months later, on June 24th, 1998, Harold made a very distinct choice that led directly to him being caught. Harold Shipman was at the home of one of his patients, a woman named Kathleen Grundy. This woman was 81 years old and described as being in great health. She had an appointment with Shipman at her home to have a routine blood test, although what she got instead was a lethal dose of diamorphine. As per his standard practice, he quickly wrote her death certificate and stated her cause of death as old age and suggested she be cremated immediately. But that wasn't the only document he forged. Somewhat unusually, he also forged a will, and it was Kathleen's will, giving all of her worldly possessions to her doctor, Harold Shipman. And it was this move specifically that raised more than a few red flags. Kathleen was a former mayor of Hyde, and for that reason was a notable person in the community, and her death was very upsetting to many, particularly her family, who were shocked not only that their healthy mother and grandmother passed away, but also that she'd left all of her money to her doctor. And with that, they began investigating Harold themselves, when they quickly realized that he was behind not only the forgery, but also the death. The family was able to confirm that Harold's fingerprints were on the will that he forged, and that the will was even typed on his typewriter that was missing a key, which undoubtedly confirmed that he was the one who wrote it. And this family somehow was able to find out about Harold's past when the police weren't able to, which at the very least is odd and borderline negligent by the police. Kathleen's family demanded that her body be autopsied, and it was during that autopsy when it was found that she had a lethal dose of diamorphine in her muscle tissue, and Harold Shipman was arrested for the murder of Kathleen Grundy. Once he was arrested, the family of 11 other victims who had their family member buried and not cremated opted to have their family members' bodies examined by the police, and these examinations also showed that these 11 other patients of Harold Shipman were also victims of his. And it was at this time that Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders from 1995 to 1998. Although in the investigations that followed his initial conviction, there was over 284 confirmed killings by Harold Shipman, and there are even more that are unconfirmed but likely possible. Just let that sink in. He was only convicted of 15 murders, but he was confirmed to have killed at least 284 of his patients, likely from the years of 1975 to 1998. Harold received life in prison, although only a few years into his sentence, he ended his own life on January 13th, 2004 at the age of 57. Shipman never never gave any motive for his murders and never admitted to any of it. These are just 3 cases of how some of the most infamous serial killers were caught. The most notorious fugitives ever on the FBI's most wanted list. About a month ago, I made a video about the FBI's most wanted list, and in that video I said if you guys wanted a separate video about the most wanted criminals ever, I'd make it. And well, here we are. Today, we're discussing the most notorious criminals to ever be on the FBI's most wanted list. And as a fair warning, this video gets crazy, and you're definitely gonna recognize some names on this list. Let's get right into it. Thomas James Holden. I knew I had to put James at the very beginning of this list, well, because it was symbolic. Thomas James Holden was the first criminal ever to be on the FBI's most wanted list, and is very likely one of the reasons why this list was even invented in the first place. Thomas was a career criminal and started his life of crime long before the FBI's most wanted list was even established. In 1926, James Holden and his partner, Francis Keating, led the Holden-Keating gang. This gang specifically specialized in committing robberies. And they weren't your old-timey purse snatcher. They were robbing banks, hijacking trucks full of money, and even held up trains, among other things. Although this gang's reign of terror didn't last long, as 2 years later, in 1928, Holden and his partner were sentenced to 25 years in prison. Although after only serving 2 years, he escaped from prison and immediately started a new gang, where once again, his career continued, and he was robbing trains, buses, and banks up until 1931 when he was captured again. After his capture in 1931, Holden served time in Alcatraz and was later paroled in 1947. But of course, that's not where the story ends. In 1949, 2 years after being released from prison, Holden murdered not only his wife, but also 2 of her relatives during a domestic dispute. After committing these murders, he fled the state, and it was this horrific crime that earned him a spot on the first ever FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list, which was officially released a year later in 1950. Holden was caught only a year later in Oregon, working a normal job and using a fake name. And after his trial, he was convicted of murder later that year. Holden died only a few years later while in prison. James was undoubtedly a horrible person, but I find this story interesting because his life of crime started long before the FBI's most wanted list. And it was partly his actions along with the actions of other career criminals that inspired the FBI to make a most wanted list, to get support from the public. And immediately after this first list was published, its usefulness became instantly obvious, as it took less than a year for the FBI to find Holden after murdering his wife and 2 other men. So yeah, Holden was the first man ever on the FBI's most wanted list, and for that reason, I knew I had to put him on this list, and I figured, why not put him first? Quick note that this video is in no specific order. I'm not ranking these people. None of these criminals are better or worse than each other. I'm not going to incentivize that. These people don't deserve that. All of these people are horrible and have done horrible things. But yeah, let's keep going. Eric Rudolph. Eric Rudolph is a domestic terrorist better known as the Olympic Park bomber, and he was responsible for numerous bombings and murders from 1996 to 1998, most notably including the bombing of Centennial Olympic Park during the 1996 Summer Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia. This bombing killed 2 people and injured over 100 others, and this was also the first of many bombings he committed. The other bombings he eventually confessed to make his motives rather clear, as he targeted and bombed 2 separate abortion clinics within Georgia, followed by bombing a lesbian bar, and then that bombing was followed by his final bombing, which was of another abortion clinic in Birmingham, Alabama. This final bombing killed a police officer and injured a nurse, among other people. Rudolph used homemade bombs that he filled with nails to maximize the damage, and he wanted to hurt people and send a message. Rudolph claimed to be against global socialism and abortion on demand, and he believed that the government was supporting both of these things, and during the 1996 Olympic Games, he saw these games as a promotion of global socialism, and he thought that the government supporting this was completely unacceptable. And because he was already upset that the US government was supporting abortion rights, he decided to go and hurt and kill innocent people. What a lunatic. In 2005, Rudolph pled guilty to multiple homicide charges and actually received 4 consecutive life sentences as a part of a plea bargain. Yeah, that was his plea deal, 4 consecutive life sentences. However, this plea bargain did allow him to avoid the death sentence, which, I mean, I'll let you form your opinion on how you feel about that. Regardless, he is currently incarcerated at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, and is also one of the most notorious criminals ever on the FBI's most wanted list. Ted Bundy. Bundy is a name that I would bet money you've heard before, and I've even talked about him numerous times on this channel, so I'm gonna keep this segment a bit brief. But I did want to toss out Ted Bundy early in this list because I figured some of you guys would be looking for names you'd recognize, so here's one. And don't worry, there's more later in the list you'll definitely recognize. Back to Ted. Ted is undoubtedly one of the most notorious serial killers of all time, and also one of the most notorious people to ever be on the FBI's most wanted list. Bundy is responsible for the abduction, assault, and murder of at least 30 young women and girls during the 1970s, and his crimes happened all across the United States of America. Bundy's typical methods of luring his victim would be by pretending to be injured or disabled, or by pretending to be an authority figure, such as a police officer. And typically what he would do once he has people's attention and trust is he would lure these young women to his car under the guise of requiring some help putting something in the trunk, typically. At that point, he would bludgeon these women unconscious and then put them in his vehicle, and then what he did from that point is just diabolical. And it's very likely you already know what he was up to. Not only would he sexually assault and kill these women, but he would also sexually assault their dead bodies and even mutilate them, keeping parts of these bodies as trophies. And that's really only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his depravity. Bundy was actually caught and escaped from prison twice, and on his third time in prison, he was eventually given the death penalty, where he was executed in 1989, ending his reign of terror. And if you're curious about exactly how Ted Bundy got caught, check out this video on screen after this video. I'll link it in the description for you. It's a video where I describe how the most infamous serial killers got caught. So yeah, Ted Bundy is not only one of the most notorious people ever on the FBI's most wanted list, he's also one of the most notorious serial killers and criminals of all time. And if you are familiar with his story, it's rather unfortunate how he was able to get away with his horrific acts for so long. But that's a story for a different video, and I have videos on my channel where I go into detail about that. Check out the serial killer series on this channel if you're interested. Let's keep moving. Victor Manuel Herrera. Victor is a notorious entry on the FBI's most wanted list for a few reasons. Firstly, because he was on the list for the longest time ever. Like, more than anybody. Like, nobody spent more time than him on the list. So I'm assuming he was pretty good at hide and seek as a kid. But seriously, jokes aside, he spent over 32 years on the list as a most wanted fugitive and was not captured ever. The only reason that he was removed from the list on December 15th, 2016 is more or less because he no longer met the requirements, which really means they decided that other criminals were more worth pursuing and having on the list. Victor was officially added to the list on May 14th, 1984, and the reason that he was added to this list was for a crime that also makes him a notable entry on the FBI's most wanted list as a whole, because he is associated with one of the largest cash robberies in US history. On September 12th, 1983, while working for Wells Fargo, Victor plotted and conducted a theft of over $7 million cash from a Wells Fargo armored car facility in Connecticut, which is just an absolutely insane feat, and adjusted for inflation, it only gets crazier. In today's money, he stole the equivalent of roughly $19 million cash. After this robbery, it is believed that he was smuggled to Mexico, and it is believed that he is now somewhere in Cuba. So yeah, Victor is on this list for a few reasons. The insane heist he pulled off, the fact that he was able to not only escape the police, but also the country, and the fact that he was able to not be caught for over 32 years while being a most wanted criminal is absolutely insane. It's a bit of a nice palate cleanse to be able to discuss a bank robbery instead of some of the other things we've discussed and will continue to discuss, because unsurprisingly, the most wanted of the most wanted are a depraved bunch. And with that, let's get to our next entry. Ramzi Youssef. I would assume everybody watching this video is familiar with the terrorist attack that took place on September 11th. However, that wasn't the only attack that took place in the World Trade Center. In 1993, a terrorist attack masterminded by Ramzi Youssef took place in the World Trade Center, and it claimed the life of 6 innocent people and injured over 1,000 others. Hours after the attack, Ramzi fled the country, and for that reason, he was put on the FBI's most wanted list. While on the run and on the most wanted list, he also essentially co-founded the Pachinko plot, which was an elaborate scheme to carry out multiple large-scale attacks and create essentially global terror. The Pachinko plot, simply put, was a plan to kill the Pope as a distraction, and then while people were distracted by the murder of the Pope, 11 planes on the way to the USA would be hijacked and bombed. Which is an absolutely insane thing to consider, that this was a serious plan that people were putting money, energy, and effort towards. Fortunately, this plan failed, and in 1995, Ramzi was arrested in Pakistan while he was attempting to put a bomb in a toy doll. At this point, after his capture, he was extradited back to the United States. Ramsey, along with two of his co-conspirators, were convicted for their roles in the 1993 bombing and the Pachinko plot. And Ramsey specifically received 2 life sentences plus 240 years for his involvement in these acts of terror. The story ends there, but I do have a few interesting facts. One of Yusuf's uncles is actually credited as one of the principal architects behind the September 11th attacks. And Yusuf is currently behind bars at the same prison that Eric Rudolph is at, the ADX Florence in Colorado. Also, interestingly, this is the same facility where Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was also held. But I guess it makes sense. These are all extremely dangerous people. Rafael Caro Quintero. During the time that Rafael was on the FBI's most wanted list, he was actually the record holder for the highest reward offered by the FBI for information. That reward being $20 million, which now is a bit more common and that record has been broken, but at the time, the FBI was not messing around and they wanted this guy. For good reason too, as Rafael is one of the most notorious Mexican drug lords of all time and is the co-founder of the Guadalajara cartel, one of the earliest and most powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Rafael was a kingpin in the drug trade during its boom in the 1980s, known mostly for his brutal tactics and massive influence and power. Rafael is most infamous for his involvement in the 1985 kidnapping and murder of a DEA agent. And this specific murder severely strained the relationship between the US and Mexico. Fortunately, Rafael was caught and was sentenced to 40 years in prison, but unfortunately, he was actually released early in 2013 due to a legal technicality. That being that a lawyer argued that his trial should have been at the state level and not the federal level. And I suppose that was enough to have him released from jail, which is insane. When news broke that this drug lord who killed an American official was released from jail, all hell broke loose. And only days after his release, the Mexican and American governments put him back on the most wanted list. However, it did take them 9 years to catch him again. And from 2013 to 2022, he was a free man until he was once again captured by Mexican authorities in 2022 and was extradited back to the United States to stand trial, specifically for drug trafficking charges. Rafael's full story and list of crimes goes far beyond the scope of this video, but trust me when I say, not only did his story at the time make headlines, but he is also definitely one of the most dangerous and notorious entries ever on the FBI's most wanted list. Semyon Mogilevich. Mogilevich is another criminal we've actually talked about on the channel before. And if you've seen that video, then you would know that Mogilevich is known as the boss of bosses, or the most powerful and dangerous gangster in the world. A pretty crazy title, but his crime resume definitely backs it up. Keep in mind, that's not a name he gave himself. That name was given to him by the FBI. Semyon is alleged to have built a vast criminal empire with involvement in every illicit activity you can think of, including extortion, money laundering, drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, murder for hire, fraud, and much more. One of his most notable accusations is his multi-million-dollar stock scheme he actually performed in Canada, where him and a group of associates were able to scam over $150 million out of investors by essentially having a fake company listed on the TSX, the Toronto Stock Exchange. Mogilevich is considered to be the most dangerous and most powerful criminal because his power comes from the sheer power of his network. Not only is he himself an educated and well-connected and rich person, but he is also connected to every rich crime boss globally, making his influence extremely dangerous and extremely powerful, which is why in 2009 they put him on their list. However, in 2015 he was actually removed from the list as there is no extradition treaty between the US and Russia, meaning that Russia has no incentive to send this criminal to the States. And for that reason, the FBI thought it made sense to put somebody else on the list that they had a better chance of getting. Although that doesn't mean that he's any less wanted or any less dangerous. Although, as of now, he is still a free man. James Earl Ray. The infamy and story of this individual is likely the most interesting and twisted by far. James Earl Ray was a small-time criminal who was arrested and eventually escaped from jail. And a year after escaping from jail, he allegedly assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. Following this assassination, Ray fled the United States, got a Canadian passport, and then traveled to London where he was recognized and caught. And the following year, he pled guilty to the crime and was sentenced to 99 years. Now that is a very simple story, but that's where the lines begin to get blurred. Because although assassinating one of the most famous civil rights leaders of all time is definitely going to earn you a spot on this list, that's not quite what everybody believes. In 1977, Ray actually escaped from prison again, and this second escape from prison would put him back on the FBI's most wanted list. I kind of forgot to mention, but the first time he was put on the FBI's most wanted list was after his alleged assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Regardless, after escaping from jail for a second time, he was caught after a 54-hour manhunt. Now, interestingly, after being re-caught and re-put in prison, Ray began to renounce his guilt, essentially saying the confession gave before wasn't true and I actually didn't do it. Now, this raised a lot of questions because at the time, and even to this day, people theorized that the death of Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't by some small-time criminal, but potentially by the government. Unfortunately, Ray never had any evidence to present that he wasn't guilty and that the government was. Most interestingly is that MLK Jr.'s family believe that Ray is not the killer, and they supported his motion to have a retrial and are very vocal about the fact that they believe that it was a government conspiracy. However, no matter how you feel about it, the judge, the government, the FBI ultimately decided that this was definitely Earl James Ray, and the case at that point was closed. Was James Earl Ray framed, or was he the assassin? I don't have an opinion on this yet, but I'm curious to know what you guys think. So yeah, James Earl Ray is one of the most notorious people on the list for allegedly assassinating one of the most famous figures in political history, and also for the conspiracy surrounding his alleged involvement. Crazy stuff, but we still got 2 more to cover. William Bradford Bishop Jr. Bishop had a seemingly perfect life. He graduated from Yale, worked as a U.S. Foreign Service officer, married his high school sweetheart, and had 3 sons with the love of his life. Now, obviously, you don't end up on this list for having a picture-perfect life. As the story goes, Bishop was denied a promotion at his job, and for that reason, he left work, withdrew a large amount of cash from the bank, purchased a ball-peen hammer, a gas can, and other supplies, went home, and then allegedly murdered his entire family, including his wife, his own mother, and his 3 sons. He then transported their bodies to North Carolina, where he buried them in a shallow grave and set them on fire, and then left the scene. Bishop's car was later found abandoned in Tennessee's Great Smoky Mountains National Park near the Appalachian Trail, where his car, full of personal items, linked him directly to the murders. However, despite multiple sightings in the US and even in Europe, Bishop has been able to evade capture ever since these murders took place. It is suggested he has done so because he is fluent in 5 languages, is an experienced outdoorsman, and his skills and background with his job made him particularly elusive. Although these murders of his entire family took place in the 70s, it wasn't until 2014 when he was added onto the list. And only 4 years later, in 2018, he was then removed from the list because the FBI stated that they wanted to focus on more recent cases. But that doesn't mean that they aren't still searching for him, but they're just not prioritizing this one to get the most wanted list exposure. To this day, Bishop could still be alive, and at this point would be 89 years old. And it is rather unfortunate how he was never able to be brought to justice, and I find it a bit odd that he was added to the most wanted list so far after he committed such heinous activities and essentially got away with it. But regardless of timeliness, he was an entry on the FBI's most wanted list, and a very notorious one at that. Now, let's get into the final entry on this list. Osama bin Laden. While this video isn't in any particular ranking, I figured it made sense to put Osama last, as he is likely by far the most recognizable person on this entire list. Osama definitely didn't need the help of the FBI's most wanted list to gain notoriety, although it did help bring awareness about this terrifying individual. Osama bin Laden is the founder of Al-Qaeda, a militant organization responsible for numerous terrorist attacks, most famously including the September 11th attacks that killed nearly 3,000 people. And while that attack is how most people are aware of Osama bin Laden, his criminal history, and even his time spent on the FBI's most wanted list far predate the September 11th attacks. Osama was actually on the FBI's most wanted list as early as 1993, mostly because of his involvement in Al-Qaeda and the numerous terror attacks that they were committing, one of which being the Mogadishu bombing, in which Somali rebels trained by bin Laden and his partners killed 18 American servicemen. That same year, Osama was also tied to the first attack on the World Trade Center, the one that we discussed previously that was primarily masterminded by Yusuf. His ties to that attack and the Mogadishu bombing were more than enough to land him a spot on the most wanted list. But that's obviously not where the story ends. 2 years later, in 1995, he attempted to have the Egyptian president murdered, and in 1996, he bombed a US Air Force complex in Saudi Arabia. And then in 1998, over 200 people died as a result of bombings in the US embassies in both Kenya and Tanzania, both of which Al-Qaeda took credit for, which means that they were directly linked to bin Laden himself. And of course, most famously, on September 11th, 2001, bin Laden was tied to an attack that not only made him one of the most wanted people by the the FBI, but one of the most wanted and most known criminals in the entire world. And following that attack, the FBI put a $25 million reward on any information that would lead to the capture of Osama. From 2001 until 2011, Osama was able to live freely, although in hiding, until May 1st of 2011, when SEAL Team 6 stormed his compound and ended his reign of terror for good. Osama bin Laden was on this list for nearly 2 decades and is likely responsible for more deaths than anybody else on this list, and is not only one of the most notorious people to ever be on the FBI's most wanted list, but one of the most notorious criminals and terrorists of all time. A truly evil individual. And ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. A list of 10 of the most notorious fugitives to ever be put on the FBI's most wanted list. From 1950 to 2025, these are 10 people that the FBI definitely won't be forgetting anytime soon. Fortunately, most of these criminals were brought to justice, and for the few that haven't, hopefully justice is served sooner rather than later. I think most people would like to believe that when you do something wrong, it'll catch up to you, whether that be legally or even just karma. But as we all know, that isn't always the case. And that's why today, I'm going to be discussing serial killers who were never caught. Horrible people doing horrible things that, unfortunately, were never served justice. At least not yet. One quick note before we begin is that these are real criminals with real victims, and I'm going to be doing my best to be respectful as possible. This video isn't in any particular order, even though this video is a list, simply because I do not want to put any of these people above or below each other. All of these people are horrible and do not deserve a ranking. Now let's get into the video. Starting off, we have the Servant Girl Annihilator. A pretty gruesome name, but he was a pretty gruesome guy. And I felt like he was an appropriate first entry for this list because he was the first known serial killer in the United States of America. Between December 1884 and December 1885, he killed 7 women and 1 man. And he had a very peculiar signature. He killed people with an axe. In just one night, on December 24th, 1885, you're right, Christmas Eve, he murdered 3 victims with an axe, which is why they also called him the Austin Axe Murderer. For obvious reasons, there's not a lot known about this killer, and that's going to be a common trend among all of these killers, unfortunately. And a lot of what is known is the sheer brutality that happened to the victims, and for also obvious reasons, I won't be going into too much detail on that. But one interesting detail that I thought I would share is the fact that there's a rather interesting conspiracy floating around with the Servant Girl Killer, specifically being that he could potentially also be Jack the Ripper. Why? Because this string of murders in Texas happened 3 years before the murders of Jack the Ripper across the pond. Could they be the same person? Personally, I'm not sure if there's any validity to it, but it's an interesting thought. Next up, we have a rather interesting situation as this entry isn't just one killer, it's likely many. I'm talking about the Highway of Tears killers. The Highway of Tears is a 719-kilometer long corridor of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Canada. And this stretch of highway has become notorious for murders that have happened on it. The crimes happening on this highway date back to as early as 1970 and are still believed to be happening to this day. Due to poor economic situations and the lack of public transportation, for a lot of the poorer citizens, hitchhiking was a big method of transportation, leaving vulnerable individuals at risk. Unfortunately, in that case, that meant many Indigenous women were at risk. Almost all of the victims of the Highway of Tears were Indigenous women, and there is believed to be at least 80 missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of the saddest parts about this stretch of highway is that a lot of these victims were never even found and are still considered missing and not homicides. And focusing on the criminals, the one interesting part is that only one person has ever been convicted on this highway, and unfortunately, they were only convicted for 1 murder and could have only possibly been able to commit 2 of them, meaning that there are likely many murderers still out there not served justice. Following that, we have the Oakland County Child Killer, also known as the Babysitter Killer. And this story is seriously twisted. As the name may imply, this killer targeted children in Oakland County. Between the span of February 15th, 1976 and March 16th, 1977, only 13 months apart, 2 boys and 2 girls aged 10 to 12 went missing outside of their homes. Each child's body was discovered in a public area within 20 days of their disappearance, and all of the children were either strangled or shot. The 4 deaths triggered a murder investigation which was at the time the largest in U.S. history, and the breaking of this news also caused a significant panic among parents in Michigan. Despite a few promising leads, including the discovery of a vehicle suspected to belong to the killer, this case remains unsolved. In 2012, we had the most recent development, which investigators were able to actually create a DNA profile of the killer. But unfortunately, this didn't match up to any of the suspects or even anybody in the police database. A quick note to mention is that the 4 victims I mentioned are only confirmed victims, and there is potentially many more. And the timeline I mentioned is only the confirmed timeline, and many more could have taken place outside of that. This is just what is confirmed for this killer. Staying on the topic of murderers who targeted children, we have the alphabet murderer, also known as the alphabet killer or the double initial killer. If you haven't noticed already, a common trend is these killers having pretty obvious names, but I don't think it hurts to spell it out. This killer had an affinity for matching initials, and all 3 of their victims had the same first and last initial, with the victims having the initials CC, WW, and MM. These unsolved child murders took place between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York. I'm starting to think it was pretty rough being a child in the 1970s. All of the alphabet killer's victims were assaulted and strangled, and despite the fact that there was witnesses, specifically several motorists who saw 10-year-old Carmen Collin half naked on the side of the highway attempting to escape the killer, the police were never able to close the case. Although police did have several persons of interest, one of them connected as recently as 2011, none of them had close enough ties to the murders to be convicted. Although interestingly, one of the alphabet killer suspects was sentenced to death for murder for killing sex workers in Nevada. Completely unrelated. Strangely though, all of his victims in Nevada had the same first and last initial. Could this be the alphabet killer from New York? Seems very possible. Shifting our focus over to Scotland now, we have Bible John, an unidentified serial killer who has killed at least 3 young women between 1968 and 1969. All of Bible John's victims are believed to have met him in the Barrowland Ballroom, a popular dance hall in Glasgow, Scotland. Most of the few details known about this case come from one of the victim's sisters, who shared a taxi with her sister and the alleged killer, Bible John. The victim's sister's information helped the investigators form a psychological profile of the killer, with one of his biggest quirks being that he frequently referenced the Bible, hence his nickname, Bible John. Unfortunately, in 2010, the victim's sister has passed away and we have lost the only eyewitness, meaning that the chances of this case ever being solved are unlikely. Returning back to the United States of America, we have a killer with probably the most outrageous name. I'm talking about the West Mesa Bone Collector. The United States media really does a good job of giving serial killers names that are way cooler than they deserve. And also just more gruesome. Like, who thought of Servant Girl Annihilator? Like, annihilation, that is an insane adjective to use. Back to the topic at hand, the West Mesa Bone Collector was a serial killer in West Mesa, Albuquerque, New Mexico. This is also one of the most recent entries on the list, as the remains of 11 women were found buried in 2009 in the desert of West Mesa, obviously. There are at least 13 other potential victims of the West Mesa Bone Collector, reported as late as 2006, who were just not buried in this one mass grave. So, confirmed 11, but potentially all the way up to 24 and beyond. Like many on this list, the police considered several suspects, but lacked enough evidence to make a strong enough case against any one suspect. Some theories suggest that the West Mesa Bone Collector may actually be a group of people involved in running a sex trafficking ring, specifically because a lot of these victims were sex workers. As recent as 2021, the police have confirmed that the case is still active, and despite the fact that the police are still receiving 20 to 30 tips per year, there is no new evidence moving the case along. Truly unfortunate. If you haven't heard about any of the killers I've mentioned in this video so far, that's about to change, because the next 2 killers I'm going to discuss are arguably some of the most well-known serial killers of all time, and that starts with the Zodiac Killer. If that name rings a bell, you probably watched the 2007 Jake Gyllenhaal and Robert Downey Jr. blockbuster movie, Zodiac. That movie has no doubt made the Zodiac Killer the most infamous unsolved serial killer in all of American history. The Zodiac Killer has confirmed to have killed 5 victims and injured 2 victims across the span of 1968 and 1969. But he claims that he has killed up to 37. Now you might be asking yourself, what do you mean claim? He wasn't caught. How did he talk to the police? Well, that's kind of where he got his name from. The Zodiac coined his name in a series of taunting messages that he mailed to regional newspapers, in which he threatened to go on killing sprees and bombings if they did not print his messages. Some of his letters included cryptographs and ciphers, in which the killer claimed that he was collecting the victims as slaves for the afterlife. This guy was twisted, and that's not even the start of it. Out of the 4 ciphers that the Zodiac made, 2 remain unsolved, and 1 was actually successfully cracked in 2020. Only one suspect has ever been named publicly by authorities, and due to the weirdness of this case and the sheer depth of the rabbit hole, there is a large public interest in this story. And I could honestly go on for hours about this with just publicly available information, but for the sake of this video, these are the important details. If this is interesting to you, I highly recommend you do some research on it, as the story does go deep. The last correspondence from the Zodiac Killer with any sort of publication was in 1974. The case has been marked inactive and then reactive a few times over the years, and in some places is still considered active to this very day. But unfortunately, even with all of the public interest, it is unlikely that this case will be solved. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for. Like I said, this video isn't in any specific order, but I did keep this one for last. One thing I will mention though is that this list isn't every single uncaught serial killer. Unfortunately, there is still a lot more that exist. I just couldn't make this video super long. But if you would like a part 2, I will gladly make it. And for the identity of our final killer, well, that's unknown. This is likely one of the most famous unknown serial killers, and also just serial killers to ever exist. I'm talking about Jack the Ripper. Even if you're not somebody who binges morbid content or watches serial killer documentaries on the weekends, you've probably heard of this name before. Jack the Ripper was an unidentified serial killer active in the slums of London, England in 1888. Jack's attacks typically involved women working as prostitutes who lived in the slums of East London. These women would have their throats cut and then have their abdominals manipulated. The removal of internal organs of at least 3 victims led to the suspicion that the killer had some surgical knowledge. The official numbers and even motives are unknown, but there are believed to be at least 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. Much like the Zodiac Killer, the Jack the Ripper lore goes much wider than the scope of this video. But one interesting point I wanted to make is that a lot of what solidified Jack the Ripper's legacy was unintentionally created by the media of the time, which is also the case for a lot more recent serial killers, for example, Jeffrey Dahmer and the like. It's a rather interesting byproduct of spreading awareness, and I thought I'd mention it. Dangerous criminals that are still on the loose, or at least were never caught. If you're a Trust Me Bro fan, then you would know that this list is only going to get more dangerous and more evil as the list goes on. So let's get started. On a chilly November day in 1971, a man calling himself Dan Cooper hopped on a Northwest Orient flight from Portland to Seattle. And he looked like any other traveler in his neat suit and tie, but Cooper had a wild plan up his sleeve. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a note to the flight attendant revealing that he had a bomb in his briefcase, and he demanded $200,000 cash, 4 parachutes, and a refueling truck waiting for him at Seattle. As the plane touched down, the drama unfolded quietly. The authorities, though shocked, met his demands, trading the cash, parachutes, and fuel for the release of 36 passengers. Cooper kept a few crew members on the flight, and they took off again, aiming for Mexico City. Once again, shortly after takeoff, high above the remote forest of southwest Washington, under the cover of night, Cooper made a bold escape. He strapped one of the parachutes onto his back, secured the money, and jumped out of the plane through the aft door. The plane eventually landed without Cooper, kicking off a massive manhunt. Despite extensive searches and a lot of speculation, Cooper vanished, leaving behind only a few clues, including a decaying package of $5,800 found years later by a boy near Columbia River. As you likely already know, or probably assumed by the title of this video, D.B. Cooper was never caught. I wanted to start this first segment with a story rather than just saying D.B. Cooper. 1, because the story is just so interesting, and 2, because I wanted to try a new format. What do you guys think? But if it wasn't already obvious, the first entry on this list is D.B. Cooper. D.B. Cooper is likely the most famous entry on this list, and he's also the most tame entry, meaning that his actions, although dangerous and scary, were not nearly as evil as compared to the other entries on this list. But I still want to take a deep dive going into the exact danger that D.B. Cooper put people in and the effects that this could have had if things went wrong. Okay, for starters, this was a literal hijacking on a commercial flight with 42 total people on the flight, 36 people including Cooper, and then also 6 staff, 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants. Now, it is my assumption that D.B. Cooper did not actually have a bomb, and then that was just a bluff to get the authorities to comply with his demands. But if he did have some makeshift homemade bomb in his briefcase, things could have went a lot differently. For starters, if the bomb was made poorly, it could have detonated on its own at any point, causing all 42 people to die on this plane, assuming that the plane doesn't crash over top of people and kill more people. That alone would have been catastrophic and a huge tragedy. Now, fortunately, as we know, that wasn't the case, but what did did inspire DB Cooper to put so many people's lives in danger? Well, like we mentioned, money. He requested $200,000 cash, which in today's money is equivalent to $1.5 million, which is no small sum of money. Now, whether or not you would act on this elaborate scheme to try to get $1.5 million is up to you, but personally, I have no interest in doing anything of the sort. And one thing I find kind of ironic is that DB Cooper was smart. Every part of this plan was calculated and executed perfectly, which leads me to believe that he was a smart and competent individual. I say this because with the skills he had and the planning he had, I don't doubt that he could have made this money honestly. But my assumption is that he must have had some sort of incident happen in his life to make him do something so crazy, which I would love to know that story, but I doubt we ever will. Anybody who's willing to hijack a plane, risk the lives of others, and steal money, in my books, is definitely dangerous. And in the eyes of the law, a criminal, which is why I added DB Cooper to this video. But honestly, Cooper was kind of a class act when it came to being a criminal. He didn't make a scene on the plane to scare any of the other travelers. He allowed all of the passengers off of the plane. Many of them didn't even know what was going on. He only kept a few staff members on the plane. One of the flight attendants on the plane said that he wasn't cruel or nasty at all and that he seemed confident and nice even. And once he got his money and parachute, he was gone. When he opened the aft door of the plane, the pilots even called back to him on the PA system and asked him if he needed help. And his last words were, "No," and we never heard from him again. So although I do not condone the actions of DB Cooper whatsoever, when it comes to dangerous criminals, I think that he went about it in a very interesting way, which is no doubt why his story is so famous and which is why I wanted to have him on this list. This, in my opinion, is probably the best case scenario when it comes to a plane hijacking situation. But let's keep going. Next up on our list, we have one of the most notorious gangsters of all time and one of the most elusive criminals in the entire world. He is known as the boss of bosses, and his name is Simeon Mikulowicz. If you're unfamiliar with Simeon, you're not alone, and this is likely because Simeon is not an infamous American gangster that's been portrayed in movies. He's not even American at all. He's of Ukrainian, Russian, and Israeli descent, but that doesn't mean his resume is any less qualified, or should I say blood splattered. I want to make very clear that I am not hyping up this person in any way, shape, or form. This person is not a good person. I'm simply speaking with emphasis for storytelling purposes. With that being said, let's get into some of Simeon's credentials. For starters, the nickname Boss of Bosses was not a self-given nickname. The government agencies of the European Union and the United States describe Simeon as the boss of bosses of most Russian mafia syndicates in the world. And he is believed to be directing a multi-billion-dollar international crime empire. And he is described by the FBI as the most powerful and dangerous gangster in the world. Oh, yeah, and if that's not enough, he was literally in the top 10 fugitive list from October 23rd, 2009, all the way till December 17th, 2015. But after hearing all of this, you might be asking yourself, what did this knucklehead get up to that got him in so much trouble? And let me tell you, this is the exact list of charges that put him on the FBI 10 most wanted fugitive list. I'm reading this directly off Wikipedia. Fraud by wire, racketeer, influenced, and corrupt organizations act conspiracy, mail fraud, money laundering conspiracy, money laundering, arms trafficking, drugs trafficking, human trafficking, aiding and abetting, murder, smuggling, prostitution, securities fraud, filing false registration with the SEC, false filing with the SEC, falsification of books and records. And I'm sure there's more. So as you can tell, this guy's a little bit of a goofball. And I'm sure you probably noticed in that list there was prostitution. And I'm sure it means something else, but I think it's kind of funny to imagine this guy selling some ass when times were tough. But honestly, I can't judge. You gotta do what you gotta do. And if this channel goes under, I might have to do the same. Mikulowicz did a lot to acquire so much wealth, but one of the first things he did to start making money was trading foreign exchange currency, or Forex, which at the time in the USSR was illegal, which he was fined and charged for, and this is likely the catalyst that got him involved in organized crime. A lot of the wealth that he controlled came from a lot of high-level corporate scams. One of my favorites including a publicly traded company on the Toronto Stock Exchange. YBM Magnex Incorporated was a publicly traded stock on the Toronto Stock Exchange, which in only a short amount of time was able to grow by over 2,000%. Seemingly a promising company and a great investment opportunity. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Mikulowicz used his economics degree and deception to forge numbers in the company's accounting, making the company seem like it was growing substantially when in reality it was just laundering money. The headquarters of this company was raided once Canadian journalists caught on that these Russian mobsters were involved with this company, and the day after the raid, the company's stock became worthless almost overnight. I'm sure there was a few savvy investors who weren't too happy about this. It goes without saying that with somebody so influential, so powerful, and so rich in the organized crime world, there is no doubt that they are absolutely a dangerous individual. And because this video is focused on criminals and not killers, I figured I would keep the crimes I focused on pretty diverse. But if you are waiting for murder stories, the next entry is for you, but be warned, it is gruesome and extremely upsetting. The final entry on this list is a serial child assaulter from Australia. He is only known by the nickname Mr. Cruel. Krul, and his story is nothing less than evil. Now, if you've seen a few Trust Me Bro videos, then you would know that we use the word assault to reference something much more evil and disturbing. Something that YouTube wouldn't like me to say, and something that I honestly wouldn't like to say either. Mr. Krul haunted Melbourne, Australia during the late 1980s and early 1990s. He's infamous for his calculated and sinister attacks targeting young girls in their homes. The way he operated was chillingly malicious. He would break into the family's homes at night, often while the family was still asleep. He would abduct, assault, and then later release the victims miles from their homes. He did this on 3 separate occasions to 3 separate victims, and the time that he kept these victims varied from 18 hours all the way up to 55 hours before they were released. What really set Mr. Krul apart from other criminals with similar intentions was the fact that he had such a methodical approach to avoiding capture. He wore gloves and a mask, making sure to leave virtually no forensics evidence behind. He also took measures to confuse the police, like bathing his victims to remove any traces of DNA before releasing them. He literally thought of everything to cover his tracks, including instructing the kids not to look at him and using a very monotone voice to keep his voice generic and unrecognizable. The case that he is most known for is also the most tragic and is one that is still kept a mystery: the abduction of Carmen Chan in 1991. Unlike his other victims, Carmen was never returned home and was found deceased a year later. And unfortunately, after this case, there was absolutely no more evidence about Mr. Krul or this case. Despite massive police efforts, including Operation Spectrum, which was specifically launched to catch just Mr. Krul, he has never been identified. The case remains one of Australia's most troubling mysteries, not just because of the crimes he committed, but also the fact that he is still on the loose today. I don't think there's any debate or any further detail required on why Mr. Krul is such a dangerous criminal, and it's truly upsetting and disturbing that he was never caught and justice was never served. Just for context of how slippery Mr. Krul was, when the Spectrum Task Force was created in May of 1991, over the next 3 years, the police searched 30,000 homes, interviewed 27,000 suspects, and spent a total of $3.8 million and still collected no meaningful evidence. To this very day, there is still a $1 million reward for any information on Carmen Chan. In a lot of cases that end up going cold and unsolved, it's very easy to blame the police for negligence, but in this case, it definitely doesn't seem like there's a lack of trying, which in my opinion makes this case much more scary and much more upsetting. The most evil women in history. It's a pretty well-known fact if you look at my channel that you guys like morbid content. Whether it be killers, torture methods, or mythical creatures, you guys like weird and scary. But unfortunately, with most of these topics, one thing I haven't really covered is women. And I'm all about inclusivity and equal representation. So in this video, I wanted to switch it up a bit and focus on the women of evil. Dangerous, evil women that kill people and more. And if you thought women were scary before this video, they're gonna be terrifying after. Let's begin. First up on our list is Beverly Allitt, one of Britain's most hated serial killers. She worked as a nurse in the children's ward in the UK and ultimately intentionally injured 13 of her patients and murdered 4 of them in the process. The 9 that did survive weren't much better for wear and were seriously injured. Beverly would administer lethal insulin injections and also inserted air bubbles into the bloods of her victim. One of the saddest parts about this story is that all of these crimes were committed in only a 2-month period, and all of her victims were infants, one of which was only 2 months old. One of the scariest parts about this story is that Beverly had no clear motives, and due to her mental health concerns, she wasn't held in prison. She's currently in a secure hospital. It is so extremely unfortunate that in such a short amount of time, this woman was able to inflict so much damage upon so many young, vulnerable people. It's truly disgusting. I suppose the silver lining is that she was relatively quickly found out after only 59 days or just under 2 months, but even one child harmed is too many in my books. Let's move on. Next up, we have Leonarda Cenciulli, a dangerous female killer from Italy. This story is a trip, so just try to follow along. To put it frankly, this woman was a nut job. She had a very rough upbringing and was extremely superstitious. Her family mistreated her, and that led her to rebel and marry a man that her family didn't approve of. She was then banished from her family, and she believed that her family had put a curse on her that would only allow her to have negative experiences. And she believed in this curse heavily. You'll see what I mean. She dearly wanted to be a mother, but unfortunately, out of the 17 pregnancies that she had, only 4 of her children survived. One of which was her son, who she loved dearly and would do anything to protect. She saw a palm reader, and the palm reader told her that all of her children would die before her, and she didn't want to believe it. Not too much longer later, in 1939, the World War II draft happened, and her son was of age to be drafted. So what did she do? Well, she thought she could have a human sacrifice to protect her son. What she did was she targeted vulnerable middle-aged women that were unhappy and unmarried and promised them a life of good fortune and much more. The first victim she invited over, she told to write all of her friends and family's postcards saying that she is so happy in life right now, and also told her to not tell anybody what she was doing. This victim came to Leonardo's house, drank wine that was poisoned, passed out, and Leonardo killed her and cut up her body and turned her body into soap and tea cakes, which she served to her friends and even her son. But unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. This one sacrifice that she did to protect her son in the war wasn't quite enough for her, so she ended up doing the same thing again 3 more times. But she was eventually caught as her last victim's sister was growing concerned of where she could be, and fortunately, she heard that her sister, the victim, was last seen going into Leonardo's house. That prompted an investigation where both Leonardo and her son, Giuseppe, were taken into custody, where she promptly admitted to everything and pled guilty to all of the charges. This case is so strange and morbid, and I honestly can't understand how one can be so superstitious. But there has to be more going on here, because nobody who's just superstitious ends up eating people. Disgusting and crazy, honestly. I know I put a lot of time into this story specifically, but I thought that this context was kind of required, and I thought that this story was just too crazy not to give more detail on. There's no doubt this woman is evil and dangerous. Let's keep moving. This next entry brings us all the way back to the 1500s in Hungary with Elizabeth Bathory. Before I get into the details, I'm going to say this. There are 2 popular beliefs about the story of Elizabeth Bathory. One is that this entire story was made up and fabricated to discredit her and her family, and the entire situation was just a witch hunt to put her away for good. And the second belief, which I think that I'm a part of after doing some research on the topic, is that everything I'm about to discuss is historical fact and true, and this lady was an absolute maniac. Elizabeth was given the nickname Blood Countess, and even Countess Dracula, as she had very odd vampiric tendencies. Elizabeth was obsessed with her looks and preserving her youth, and unfortunately, she thought that the best way to do so was by bathing in the blood of her virgin servants, and that's exactly what she did. She began torturing, beating, and murdering them, and then draining the blood from their bodies and doing what she wished with it. Allegedly, her husband even built her a torture chamber in their castle where she could inflict horrific acts on the servant girls. Of course, she only had so many servants and consistently needed to recruit new servants to become a victim of hers, which she would prey upon the daughters of younger class families who felt blessed to have the opportunity to interact with the higher classes. Unfortunately, their daughters never returned home. After targeting the daughters of noblemen, formal complaints were submitted and Bathory was investigated, and her crimes were uncovered. She was convicted of 80 counts of murder, and in 1611 was confined to a room in a castle with only slits for food and air, and she died 3 years later. Now, I'll let you guys make up your mind about whether or not this woman was dangerous and evil or not, but the fact that there is so much evidence, 52 collected statements, and the fact that this has stayed through history for almost 600 years, to me definitely says that she's not innocent and likely not a great person either, at the very least. But let's keep going. Now, bringing it back to the modern day in the United Kingdom, we have Joanne Dennehy, another one of the UK's most notorious female serial killers. She's also known as the Peterborough ditch murderer because she would throw bodies in ditches in Peterborough, where she lived. Kind of self-explanatory, but to put it bluntly, Joanne is a narcissistic psychopath who had a very unfortunate draw to men and extremely evil intentions. And by draw to men, I don't mean that she was interested in men, I mean that men could not resist her. She had some sort of magnetic personality that people were just attracted to. And this, unfortunately, isn't super uncommon for narcissists and sociopaths when you first meet them. Just for a bit of context of how evil this woman truly is she's by professionals and experts considered one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous woman to be in the criminal system in the United Kingdom right now as we speak. In March of 2013, Joanne and her accomplice, Gary Richard, had the grand idea of mimicking Bonnie and Clyde by murdering 9 men. And unfortunately, over the course of 10 days, they murdered 3 men and severely injured 2 others by stabbing them. She was eventually caught when the poorly hidden bodies were found. And if you want to really know how truly messed up this person was, when the first body was found, he was naked from the waist down and his top half was covered in a sequin dress. She specifically dressed up the body like this to humiliate him as his body was found, if killing him wasn't bad enough. Investigators immediately knew that they were dealing with a deeply disturbed individual, and after they caught her, they knew that they were exactly right. The first victim that they found was actually her landlord, and the next 2 victims were random dog walkers that they found on the road. There's a lot more deep and disturbing details to get into about this specific situation, and they're honestly more than the scope of this video without making it 10 hours long, but I think I covered most of the important details to convey the information that this woman is evil, dangerous, and straight up menacing. But we're not done yet. Let's keep going. This next dangerous woman was described by the judge of the case as evil himself. So if there's any entry fitting for the list. It's this one. This entry also has an interview available on YouTube, which I watched for this video, and it is very disturbing, and you can see exactly how strange and genuinely crazy this person is. The way that they were able to justify their crimes to themselves and just lie is absolutely astonishing, and well, I'll just say it's strange, and if you're interested in watching it, you can look it up. The last thing I'll say before I reveal her identity is this. This case is very odd because if you watched our last video, you'll notice a common theme of serial killers focusing on sex workers. But in this case, it is the complete opposite. This dangerous woman was a sex worker who killed her clients and made them her victim. If you don't yet know who I'm talking about, I'm speaking on Eileen Wuornos, also known as the Damsel of Death. Like essentially every serial killer, Eileen had a very troubled upbringing, and this no doubt led to the life that she led. She worked as a sex worker in the 1980s along highways in Florida, and between 1989 and 1999, she killed a total of 6 men in only a 12-month period. She would drug men, shoot men, rob men, take their cars, and drive their cars back to her home. She was ruthless, yet in court claimed self-defense, and although her sanity was questioned and very much questionable, she was not granted an insanity plea and was actually sentenced to death, where she did die in 2002 via lethal injection. There's a lot more entries that I could have put on this list, and there's a lot more I wanted to put on this list, but I just couldn't put it in the amount of time. We're a bit behind at the Trust Me Bro studio, so I made this video a bit shorter so we could get it out on time. Who left this little random baby in the park? How you doing, little guy? Are you okay?
Why are you so ugly? You look ugly and you look stupid.
Funny, yeah, well, at least my parents didn't ditch me in the woods, so yeah, enjoy eating rocks for dinner. Peace out. When you think of kids, you probably think of cuteness, innocence, and maybe brutal honesty. But one thing you probably don't think about is evil. Well, in this video, I'm gonna be talking about kids that did evil things. And whether or not it's my place to say if someone is truly evil or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that everything I'm about to mention that these kids did was definitely evil. Now let's get into it. Starting off our list, we have Josh Phillips, who was only 14 years old when he committed his evil act. Phillips grew up in Pennsylvania, but he was moved to Florida with his mother and abusive drug-addicted father. One very important and interesting detail about the story is that there was absolutely no signs that Phillips could potentially be capable of what he ended up doing, at least none that were reported. He was described as quiet and friendly by neighbors in Florida. The mother of Josh's victim even said that her daughter and Josh were good friends and she had no reason to be scared of him. Teachers even described him as a popular kid who didn't stand out, and he had no prior criminal history. So what exactly did Josh do to end up on the list of most evil kids? According to Phillips, on November 3rd, 1998, he was home alone when Maddie Clifton, who lived across the street from Phillips, came to his house asking him to come outside and play baseball. Phillips agreed even though he knew he wasn't allowed to hang out with friends when his parents weren't home. As the two were playing baseball, according to Phillips, he hit Clifton's eye, causing her to bleed, cry, and scream. Phillips panicked knowing that his father would come home soon and he was fearing his reaction. Phillips dragged Clifton into the house saying that her clothes came off as he dragged her into the house, and then he hit her in the head with the baseball bat to stop her from screaming before putting her under the base of his bed. When Josh's dad came home, he chatted with him for a bit and then went back to his room to see that Maddie was still alive in his bed. He at that point removed the mattress and then stabbed her 7 times with a knife, killing her. Maddie's disappearance was reported 5 p.m. that day, and there was a 6-day-long search looking for her, which Phillips participated in. I think one of the most unfortunate parts about the story, besides the absolute tragedy of Maddie Clifton's death, is the fact that Phillips' mother was the one to discover the body in his bed when she was cleaning his room and noticed a wet spot. Prosecutors have a few issues with the story that Josh told, specifically being that it is very unlikely that her clothes came off when he dragged her into the house because there was no dirt on or around her clothes, and the fact that there was no blood on the bat or in the backyard, making his story have almost no validity, and unfortunately, we will probably never know the real story. Moving on, we have Edmund, or Ed Kemper. Kemper was born on December 18th, 1948 in Burbank, California, and he committed his atrocious act at only 15 years old. At least the first of his atrocious acts, but we'll get there. On August 27th, 1964, Kemper was sitting at the kitchen table with his grandmother when they unfortunately had an argument. Angered, Kemper stormed off and grabbed his rifle that his grandfather had given him for hunting. He re-entered the kitchen and shot his grandmother in the face once and then shooting her twice more in the back. Kemper then waited for his grandfather to return home from grocery shopping, where he shot him in the face in the driveway. At this point, Kemper didn't know what to do, so he called his mother and she told him to call the police, which he did, and he waited to be arrested. When in custody, Ed shockingly reported that he he just wanted to see what it would feel like to kill grandma. If it hasn't already become obvious yet, this video is pretty dark, and it's only gonna get darker, so buckle up. Kemper was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and was sent to the criminally insane unit of the state hospital, where he shockingly only served 5 years. Kemper was able to be released so early because he was able to convince his psychiatrist that he was rehabilitated, and he was released on his birthday, December 18th, 1969, which to me is criminally negligent, knowing what I'm about to discuss. If you had any hope that Kemper was successfully rehabilitated, I am extremely sorry to burst your bubble, but that is simply not the case. Upon his freedom, Kemper decided to viciously murder 6 women and even kept their heads as trophies. He then killed his own mother and his friend, and at that point turned himself back into the police. He says that his justification for the killing spree was that he wanted to get revenge on his abusive mother, and now that that was complete, his job was done. This kid was definitely evil. That being Graham Young, also known as the serial poisoner in England. Born in London on September 7th, 1947, Young's obsession with poison and poisoning things began at a very young age, and unfortunately, that obsession was able to flourish and develop as it took a while for people to catch on. Young used his family and even classmates as lab rats for his poisons, all of which made them extremely sick, but didn't kill them yet. Graham's preferred method of delivering this poison was in his victims' food and drink, a very unsuspecting place. Graham's first official murder took place on April 26, 1962. Yes, Easter Sunday. Graham's stepmother passed away shortly after drinking some tea that Young had added chemicals to. Fortunately, some of his teachers and even his own aunt grew suspicious of him and called the police. Young was arrested, and at the age of 14, while being detained at the Broadmoor Hospital, he pledged guilty to 3 non-fatal poisonings and even admitted to killing his own stepmother with poison. Now, unfortunately, similar to Ed Kemper, because Young was held at a mental institution, his stay was rather short, serving less than 9 years. And upon his release, he went on to poison 70 more people, killing 2 of them. Young was once again arrested on November 21st, 1971, where he was ultimately sent to jail, where he eventually died of a heart attack. Was he poisoned? Nobody knows, but it's a happy thought. Following this serial poisoner, we have a trio of evil children, those being Paul Gingrich, Chase Williams, and Colt Lundy. 15-year-old high school freshman Colt Lundy, with the help of 2 of his friends, shot his stepfather in the chest 4 times, killing him. Lundy's friends and co-conspirators were 12-year-old Chase Williams, who was on lookout during the evil act, and 12-year-old Paul Gingrich, who also shot Lundy's stepfather. One of the craziest parts of the story is why they killed him. Was he an abusive drunk? Was he the worst father ever? Well, according to the boys, they just wanted to run away, and they felt the need to kill him so he wouldn't catch them and get mad at them. That is definitely some 12-year-old logic. Another crazy detail is that Paul Gingrich, at only 12 years old, was the youngest person ever to be tried as an adult and was served 25 years. Lundy received 30 years, and Chase, who stayed outside on watch, got 6 years in a juvenile corrections facility. What all of these boys did was evil, but do I believe that all of these boys were evil? I'm not sure, but it definitely seems that the older boy was a negative influence, to say the least. Next up, we have David Brahm. Similar to Ed Kemper, David Brahm's evil act was triggered by a simple argument. But as we learned with Ed Kemper, an argument can turn vile. And unfortunately, that's exactly the case with David Brahm as well. Around 11:30 p.m. on the night of February 17th, 1988, Brahm had gotten into an argument with his dad once again about the music he was listening to. For Brahm, this was the final straw, and the next morning, Brahm took an axe to his father and is shockingly reported saying that his father kept getting up and he had to keep hitting him to keep him down. So that's it, right? He just killed his dad because he was mad at him. Unfortunately not. Immediately after killing his father, he then killed his mother and 11-year-old brother and younger sister, all with that same axe. Now, weirdly, but also fortunately, hours later, Brahm asked a female classmate to skip class with him, which she did, and during their time together, he confessed everything to her. He then turned himself in, where he was arrested and sentenced to 53 years in prison. I really don't think that there's any debate on whether or not this 16-year-old who murdered his entire immediate family with an axe was evil or not. Up next, and our second last entry on the list, is Kipland Kip Kinkle, a seriously twisted individual. Kinkle never liked school and performed very poorly, and even had to repeat the first grade and was eventually diagnosed with a learning disability. But that is absolutely no excuse for the evil acts he committed. By only the 8th grade, Kipling was hiding guns in his bedroom and was caught ordering books on how to make bombs and even shoplifting. But these acts are going to seem like child's play when I tell you about the true evil that he committed shortly after. On May 20th, 1988, 15-year-old Kipling was arrested and expelled from his high school in Springfield, Oregon, after a stolen gun was found in his locker. That night, after returning home from being interrogated by the police, the teenager pulled a gun from his secret stash and killed both of his parents. And if the story ended there, it would be a very gruesome tale, but unfortunately, that's only the beginning of the story. The next morning, Kipling brought his entire gun collection to school and opened fire in the cafeteria, killing 2 students and injuring 25 more. Some rather heroic students were able to control the situation until police arrived, and disturbingly, while questioned, Kipling said that he heard voices in his head instructing him to kill, and that he himself wanted to die. He is now serving an 111-year sentence. Truly an evil individual. Our final entry on this list is maybe one of the most shocking because of how recent it was and also because of how young this evil child was. In 2007, a very young 8-year-old Amarjit Sada claimed the title of the world's youngest serial killer. Sada was born in a small, poor village in India in 1998. In 2006, Sada killed his 6-month-old sister, who was left at a primary school to be taken care of while his mother was running errands. Sada took her out of her crib at the school and brutally murdered her and buried her in a shallow grave, and then later returned home like nothing happened. When questioned by adults whether or not he did such a thing, he freely and proudly admitted to this evil doing and even brought people to the grave. He was arrested and when questioned by police, simply smiled and asked for cookies. There isn't much more known about this truly terrifying and tragic case, but one of the most scary elements about it is that he was only sentenced to 3 years under Indian law, and he is now free to live his life however he pleases. I understand he was only 8 years old, but that sort of evil activity in a person needs to be monitored long term. But for now, that's all from me. Thank you guys so much for watching this video, and let me know what you guys think. Were these kids evil, or were they just simply a victim of their circumstance? To me, it seems like there's a lot of elements at play, but it never justifies their actions.